Okay, I think we're live. So
So
this
it'll
is
it'll appear in the group
yeah,
as a live video. Okay,
yeah, and it'll be
cool.
on YouTube as well, so people will be able to watch it after the live broadcast. So
Okay,
I had to use the religious debates channel because I haven't got any other YouTube channels set up, so it may show up as religious debate on my name.
okay.
Oh, and now I've got myself coming through on YouTube, which is confusing. Let's mute that. Right.
Yeah.
So this is Joel Pearson and Stephen Ford. Do you prefer Stephen or Steve? Or...
Whatever. Different people call me, whatever they want.
Okay,
I
fair enough.
can go by Steve sometimes. Most people call me Steven.
We'll go with Stephen then, which is the usual.
All right.
So, uh, your perspective on the historicity of Jesus. So, I'm a Jesus mythicist. I don't think there was a real historical Jesus, and you presumably think there was
Mhm.
a historical Jesus.
Yes. Yes.
Could you start by saying which historical Jesus it is that you, in particular, think that existed?
Which historical Jesus? You mean like whether he was an apocalyptic prophet or like a zealot or
Yeah,
whatever?
let's just give me like a basic what you vision his life as in outline.
Well, I'd rather not get into that and just talk about the bare um, the bare uh, idea that there was a man who actually uh, the letters of Paul are about and the Gospels are about, that there's a real man behind all those writings and everything. I'd rather just discuss the generic existence of Jesus. I don't really want to get into like what his goal was or anything like that. I think that's a different kind of topic. But
Well, anything that we don't know, fair enough. But it
mm,
probably helps to have a vision of what the two different alternatives discussed are. Because if it's just a guy called Jesus, then it's difficult
yeah.
to work out where evidence fits into the two different alternatives.
Well, okay, so my claim is just that there was a first century Jewish street preacher who was Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth. I'm not gonna um, I'm not gonna make a bunch of claims about a lot of the details of his life. I think the details are kind of obscure, but the fact that he had a public ministry and started a religious movement and was crucified by the Romans for sedition. I think those are some pretty well established facts. That's all I'm going to be arguing for. That there was a man in the first century named Yeshua who started a religious movement and was crucified by the Romans for sedition. And it's the specific guy who is talked about in the letters of Paul, for instance, who had most likely had 12 followers, one of which would have been Peter, Cephas, who Paul knew personally, who was one of the leaders in the church, one of the main leaders in the early
So,
church.
so you think the 12 disciples were the apostles, except for Paul, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I don't
So
know. I don't know if the names, the canonical names are all exactly right, but I mean, I think that it was likely there was 12 of them.
yeah, because we've got inconsistent lists of names, but well, I
Mhm.
don't know. 12 seems like an astrologically significant zodiac reference, not necessarily the number of disciples. Plus, you'd expect that to go up
And
and
that could be
down
the
over
reason. That could
time.
be one of the reasons that Jesus picked 12 because of the astrological or religious significance. 12 is also a significant number in Judaism. There are 12 tribes of Israel, things like that. So,
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a number that they use
hmm.
just repeatedly in religions. So these disciples then. So we know, for example, the apostles could write. So at least some of them could. So presumably there's a bit of a mix.
I don't know. I mean, okay, if you're also including Paul, then yes, I think
No,
Paul
even
could write.
excluding Paul, it's unlikely that Paul was the only apostle who could write, especially if they're keeping all these churches organized and their leaders, especially if they're talking about reading scriptures. So if you take Paul's
Well, they
the way
memorize
Paul speaks
scripture,
about it,
so
so that would be memorization. versus reading. So Paul would have a massive advantage over all the rest of the apostles then.
Yeah, which is probably why his brand of Christianity won out at the end. So,
well, I think that was
can
probably
we
more to
can
do
we
with
get
the
into
Gentile
the?
versus Jew.
All right. Yeah, I mean, there were several things that gave Paul the edge, but I kind of want to get like straight into the arguments, if that's all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to get an image of which Jesus you were defending and what exact
Okay.
scenario you were thinking of. It's very odd for Paul not to mention that they were illiterate.
All right. Well, I don't think it's that odd, but
Well, he
I
was
mean,
arguing against them, trying to get one over them, and be a
okay.
very odd thing for him to not mention. But anyway, yeah, sure. What's
Well,
the main piece of evidence you think would support Jesus?
so the main piece of evidence that I'm going to use are the letters of Paul, because I think the letters of Paul alone, if we just discount the Gospels, if we just discount Josephus, Tacitus, all the other pieces of evidence that someone might put forth as evidence for Jesus, I think just the letters of Paul alone are sufficient evidence. And the reason I say that is because I don't think it requires that much evidence to well, I don't want to say prove, but to have, it doesn't require that much evidence for us to think that somebody existed. For instance, I just want to read you a quick passage from, well, in Cicero's first letter to Atticus, uh, when he says Aulus Caninius Satyrus got sued by his cousin Publius Varius, that one brief mention is sufficient evidence for the existence of Aulus Caninius Satyrus, the cousin of Publius Varius, even though he is not mentioned in any corroborating accounts. So
Yeah, for your average
just
historical
a brief
person,
mention like that is sufficient evidence that somebody existed, in my opinion.
absolutely.
And
For
I
most
think
people,
that yeah, and I think that well, when I look at the evidence for other historical figures, um, for a lot of other historical figures, actually, for instance, Demetrius first of Macedon, Thales of Miletus, Pythagoras of Samos, Cleomenes the third, Zeno of
Heracles,
Citium.
Zeus, Hera.
No, I'm talking about historical figures. The
Well, how do
evidence
you
for
know the
these
difference if
historical
you only need
figures
one
that
mention?
I just referenced are the evidence for these historical figures that I just listed are worse than the evidence for Jesus. Like the evidence for Jesus is significantly better than the evidence for these historical figures.
Yeah, it's
And
more on
so
par
I think
with
that if
Heracles,
we're
for
being
example.
consistent, uh, no, what's the evidence for Heracles?
Well, we have loads of stories about him in the gospel style, for example. We have many different contradictory accounts, but there's plenty of mentions of Heracles. So if you only need one mention to make someone exist, unless, of course, there's more to it than that.
Okay. Is there a letter um, by anybody who claims to have met Heracles' brother?
There isn't one who claims to have met Jesus' brother.
Paul claims to have met Jesus' brother in Galatians 1:19.
No, claims to have met a brother of the Lord, a title
Mm-hmm.
within the cult.
Well, so um, what's your belief about the term "brother of the Lord"? What do you think that means? You
Well,
think it
every time
means
you already know,
just
presumably, that
just
all
baptized Christian?
Christians, yeah, all Christians who were initiated into the cult were brothers or sisters of the Lord, as Paul
Okay.
repeatedly mentions.
Okay. So
So is that sufficient
if
evidence
that's
on
what
its
you
own?
think, if that's what you think, then
He even mentions multiple brothers of the Lord and mentions them having wives.
yeah. Um, so the thing is, when I look at Galatians 1:19, I think it's pretty clear that he's referring to see when he says brother of the Lord, he's contrasting that with apostles. So the because he says he saw no other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. So in other words, James is an
Yeah, which means
apostle,
James is not
who's
an
also
apostle.
no, it does. What? He says, I
So
saw no
if he
other
said,
apostles except for James, the Lord's brother,
yeah,
meaning
so he'd
James is an
say,
apostle.
I saw the apostles, James and Peter, or I saw the apostle Peter and someone who was not an apostle, James. That makes more sense with that sentence structure.
Say that again.
So if he saw the apostle James and the apostle Peter, he would say, I saw the apostles, James and Peter. If he sees
Mm-hmm.
an apostle and then remembers, oh, I have to mention everyone I met, which is the whole context of that. If you read it in context, it's
Mm-hmm.
actually Paul making sure that there's no one can accuse him of getting his knowledge from anyone else around there. Like he wants to cover his tracks and say, no, I didn't learn this from anyone. I got it purely from visions. So he's
Mm-hmm.
saying, I met the apostle Peter, and oh yeah, I met a brother of the Lord, James.
Uh-huh. Oh, no, he says I saw no other apostles except James. No other apostles
Exactly.
except James, meaning
I saw
James is
no
an
other
apostle.
apostles, except I did see
So,
James. So if you read that sentence in context, and especially the way it's phrased, is very odd.
see, no. I mean, it would be odd the way it's phrased in your reading, because in your reading it would be kind of redundant, because uh,
It would be very odd to say
because
anything
the thing
other
is,
than the
if
apostles,
James
James, and Cephas.
if brother just meant brother of the Lord, if brother of the Lord just meant baptized Christian, then he should have said,
I didn't see any other
I
apostles
saw no
except I
other
saw a brother of the Lord.
brothers except James, right? Wouldn't he have said that he would have said, I saw no other brothers except James, right? That would have made more sense, instead of I saw no other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So he's contrasting brother with apostle.
Exactly.
And
So if he was talking about if since we already know he refers to brothers of the Lord and brothers and sisters of the Lord and just general brothers and sisters in Christ about the whole cultic kin selection thing, not kin selection, you know what I mean, um, false kinship, fictive kinship system, it would make more sense for him to say James the apostle, the brother of Jesus, or any sort of like brother of the Lord in the flesh, any way of saying there's a difference between fictive kinship, which is the general cult brothers and sisters, and actual biological brothers, or presumably half brothers, if he's going with the whole virgin birth thing of Jesus. But there's no hint in Paul that he ever has to tell the difference. It's as if there's only one of those two kinds, the kind that he actually mentions, which is
well,
the brothers and sisters in the cult.
the thing is, he doesn't say a brother of the Lord. He says the brother of the Lord.
Yeah, because there's one of them.
There's one of what? One brother of the Lord?
Yeah, one brother of the Lord in that room, the person he's talking to.
If brother of the Lord
Although
means
presumably it was the person who came and
Christians, then there's
introduced
more
him.
than one.
Since it was his first time there to meet Peter, it would be the guy at the door who brought him up and introduced him to Peter.
No, but okay, so saying a brother of the Lord would also indicate one, and it would make more
Exactly.
sense if
The
brother of the
brother of the Lord.
Lord, if brother of the Lord meant Christian, just meant Christian, then it would make more sense to say a brother of the Lord instead of the brother of the Lord.
No, you're talking about the specific
There
one
has to
who
be
was there.
there's something significant about James being the brother of the Lord.
Yeah, the one who was there at the place, the only one there. Not a brother of the Lord called James who like it's not like there were loads of Jameses milling around. There was one guy there called James who introduced him presumably to Cephas. We don't know at that point. But the whole thing is even when you're dealing with Paul, so you already know presumably that huge chunks of Paul's letters have been ripped out. These are pastiches stitched together from other multiple letters, which is the consensus view. Paul's letters have been assembled from other pieces of his letters, and there was a very small selection out of the total body of work that he wrote. So when it comes to interpreting very fine details of grammar in Paul, you have to consider, not to mention the copying errors, the interpolations, the issues just with centuries of messing around with his work. So every
Yeah,
time
but I mean that
we
may
always
be
have
the
to keep
case,
that in
but it's
mind when
still
you're
it's
looking at
still
the
the case
structure.
that the majority of the sentences in the letters of Paul, like the majority of the sentences are not interpolations. The
How do you
majority of
know
the
that?
sentences. Do you
I mean, I'm
disagree?
not arguing that this is an interpolation. I'm pointing out that just the general caveat. If you're going to start digging into the individual meanings of a single letter in a single position, you have to remember all the massive amount of corruption that's been documented on these, and the fact that we don't have the originals in any form.
Yeah, but that
So,
doesn't really get us anywhere.
yeah, that caveat aside, which means that this is always going to be a tentative conclusion in either direction.
Yeah,
You
of
can't
course.
say one way or the
Right.
other with any
Yeah.
certainty. But
Mhm.
this means if there was an actual brother of Jesus, which is not mentioned in there, and if for some reason Paul never thought he had to specify the difference between the two kinds of brothers of the Lord, and if for some reason this happened to be James the Apostle, then why was James not higher ranking than Peter? Why was James never mentioned anywhere else in this regard? Like, why is that not relevant? Paul
I mean, I
never,
don't see
it
any
never
reason
occurred
why
to Paul to mention this.
why he would be higher ranking than Peter, because I mean, Jesus.
Literal
I mean,
brother
Jesus probably
growing up
spent
in
more
the same
time
house.
with Peter.
So
I mean, the thing
Peter's
is,
someone.
I don't talk to my brother that much. I mean, we're not that close. We live in different states. I mean, like
One of the pillars of the
I
cult.
don't really find it that confusing why somebody who had been a very active part of Jesus' public ministry before his death would have had a higher rank than somebody who happens to be related to Jesus
So now,
biologically.
now James has got
So
extra information. You know about his not participating in the cult until a certain point.
okay, yeah.
So where are you getting that from?
Well, it's part of the Christian tradition. I mean, I don't know about that for certain, but that is an explanation. Like you said, you claim that it's odd that James isn't higher ranking than Peter. Well, I'm claiming it's not that odd. I mean, there's potential reasons for that. Just because he was the
Well, it's
biological
mostly
brother
odd.
doesn't
That
mean.
mostly
Well,
odd that
I
you have
mean,
to rely on one sentence, which is very ambiguous and poorly phrased, if it was
no,
an
it's not just
apostle.
one sentence. There's lots of other references to Jesus' earthly life in the letters of Paul. I can give you more if you
Okay,
want
well
to
that
move
that
on.
one's a bit of a wash. So what else do you have that's
Well, I don't think it's
strong
a
evidence
wash.
for
I
Jesus?
think that I saw no other apostles except James, the brother of the Lord. I mean,
Yeah, so that makes
the
sense if James is
apostles.
not an apostle. It doesn't make sense if James is an apostle.
See, what it's saying is that um, not all apostles are brothers of the Lord. Not all apostles fall into this category that James is in as a brother
Well,
of the Lord.
none of
But
the apostles would technically
James
be.
is in the category of apostle
Yeah, so
because
none
he
of the
wouldn't.
apostles would be considered brothers of the Lord in that sense, because if you're using their title, they would be an apostle, which would be one rank higher than brother of the Lord.
Say that again.
If a brother of the Lord is your standard member of the cult, then apostle would be a rank
Uh-huh.
higher, so they would no longer be referred to as brothers of the Lord. So it makes sense for this to be not an apostle, which is why he says, "I saw no other apostles."
See, the thing is, he's including James in the category of apostles in the sentence. I mean,
He
if you look at
explicitly did not. He
the
literally just
original
said,
Greek, the
"No
original Greek
other
literally
apostles."
says, yeah, except. The original Greek word for accept is if not, meaning
It also means other things.
I saw no other apostles if not James, the Lord's brother. So
Also
if
means an
not,
addendum to the sentence.
basically, I mean, he's basically saying, if I had not met James, then I would not have met any other apostles. Because I met
That's
James, I didn't meet
so
another
the thing
apostle.
about Greek is there's
If not,
multiple
yeah,
meanings to the words and there's multiple ways to use them in context. So obviously, if it was two apostles, then he would say, "I saw two apostles." This is, "I saw no other apostles." But I should also
if not.
mention, yeah,
No, he doesn't say but. He doesn't say but.
yeah, that so if not,
The word but is not in there.
yeah, so this word can also mean, "Oh, but I should mention this." It's there's more than one meaning
Can
for
you
the
show
same word.
me an example of? Can you point me to a verse where that that Greek word? It's I think it's pronounced I me or e me.
I've not got it at the
If
moment,
not,
but there's
can you
a
point me to
peer-reviewed
a
paper
verse where
examining
it's
this
used in that
issue.
way?
So that
Okay,
there is a paper by Carrier, which I think
right.
was in it's in Hitler Homer Bible Christ, and it was also published in a peer-reviewed journal, but I forget which one at the moment. But we can go look it
Okay,
up later.
all right. So the next um, the next verse I would point to would be where Paul says that Jesus was crucified by the rulers of this age in 1 Corinthians 2:8.
Yes, the Archons, the demons,
Yeah,
which
except
is
I think
used
that
elsewhere in the Bible as well.
in context, I think that it's pretty clear that he's talking about human rulers.
Well, if you went with the Romans,
And,
he would have said the Romans. If you went with Pilate, he would have said Pilate. This is very clearly a theological point he's making.
well, he uses the word archon in another
Yes,
verse.
demons.
No, wait, hang on. Let me find it.
So I should clarify while you're looking that it is entirely possible that Paul was talking about Jesus, but as in like a historical earthly Jesus, but it's just not
Mhm.
as likely given the very odd way Paul talks about him, the way that Paul is unaware of Jesus ever having done or said anything, been anywhere, having any relatives, or he doesn't know about Mary, he doesn't know about
Well,
Joseph, he doesn't know about
no
Nazareth.
relatives except his brothers.
Well, like, that's the thing. He doesn't mention brothers. He explicitly
Yeah,
says
he
not
does.
that guy.
In the verses, well, in the verse that I
So
mentioned
when
in
he mentions
Galatians
brothers, he talks
1:19,
about all
he
Christians.
also
So
he also
unless you're going
talks
to
about,
say that every single Christian is one hell of a massive family of Jesus, then you have to admit that he doesn't always mean brother in a biological sense.
yeah, you're right. He doesn't always mean it, but there are a couple times where he does mean it because he contrasts that with apostles.
But that's
So
your
in
reading
First
into it.
Corinthians 9:5, he also mentions Jesus' brothers, and in that verse,
He doesn't
First
say Jesus'
Corinthians,
brothers. Make sure you get it right.
okay, in First Corinthians 9:5, he he also contrasts brother of the Lord with apostles.
Yeah, there you go. Not Jesus' brothers, brothers of the Lord.
Okay, all
Contrasted
right,
with apostles. So
yeah,
there you go.
brothers of the Lord. He contrasts them with apostles.
Absolutely. So the brothers
And
of the Lord were not
the way, no,
apostles.
no, no, it's the way that he said that, which is significant, or it's the way that he phrases it that's significant. Um, let me find it. All right. Do we not? Okay, here it is. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Well, see, he says, as do the other apostles, right? Because he's in, I mean, he's
Because
in that
he's an
category of
apostle,
apostles.
so
So
he's
he's
in
not
the
saying,
category then.
he's not going to say as do the apostles because he's an apostle. He's saying as do the other apostles, right? That's why he uses the word other. But he doesn't use the word other for brothers of the Lord, which is strange because he would be a brother of the Lord, right? If he was
What,
using it in
Paul?
this way, if he was using brother of the Lord just to mean
No,
Christian,
Paul's
then
an
why would
apostle.
he? But
Paul's an
he is
apostle,
also a
not a
brother of
brother
the
of the
Lord,
Lord.
right?
So in the same sense that
An apostle is a brother of the Lord, right? An apostle is a baptized Christian.
in the
So
same sense that you
not
could
all baptized
say
Christians are apostles, but all apostles are baptized Christians.
well, you could say that any leader of a group is also a member of the group, but you wouldn't call them a follower. Like you wouldn't call a cult leader a follower.
Okay.
So if the brothers of the Lord are the followers, and then the leaders are say pastors or whatever it is, then you
Brothers
tend
of
not
the
to
Lord
call
are the
the
followers.
pastors followers.
So brothers of the Lord only refers to non-apostles. That's what you're saying?
Well, no, because in the theological sense, brothers of the Lord means all Christians. And then in the
Yeah.
hierarchical sense, then you've got apostles and you've got brothers of the Lord. And of course, later on in Christianity, you get further divisions for deacons and bishops and whatnot. I think after a certain point, they stopped using the term apostle, didn't they?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what point they stopped using the word apostle. I'll have to look into. I'll have to do a word search on brother, because I'm pretty sure at some
It's when
point
they
Paul
moved
refers to
from.
himself as the brother of the, as a brother of the Lord, and refers to Peter as a brother of the Lord. I mean,
I think it was the point they switched from the scriptures being like the Torah and so on to the scriptures being the letters of Paul and the Gospels. That's when they started to cement things down and stop it being about visions and started having hereditary authority to say, my line of teachers goes back to the disciples and that sort of thing.
all right. So I'm looking up. I'm looking up Archons right now. Let me just.
Want me to fill in with some song and dance?
All right. Okay, so Romans 13:3. All right,
So
so Romans 13:3 says, "For the rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval." So do you think he's talking about demons here?
well, it's just rulers in general, isn't it?
Archons, yeah, that's the word. Archons. It's the
Absolutely.
same
Yeah.
word
So
used in 1 Corinthians 2:6,
yeah.
2
So in
or
the
2:8.
apocalypticist mentality, then the rulers on the earth are under the control of the demons, and uh, when you're talking about rewards as well. So don't forget they had different perspectives in different areas. So I think Paul was quite in favor of Rome in general and sort of keeping the peace. But you've also got factions of Christianity which were quite antagonistic to Rome. So, for example, your version of Jesus was killed for sedition. So
Yes.
to survive in Rome, and that was Romans, wasn't it? So Paul's talking to the Romans saying, please don't antagonize the leaders in Rome,
Yeah.
which
And
makes
he uses
perfect
the word
sense for them.
archons.
Yeah.
He uses the word, it's the same word he uses in 1 Corinthians 2:8.
Yeah, absolutely. Greek has multiple
So,
meanings for the same word. Well, all
yeah.
languages do really. So it's always contextual.
Yeah, but can you point to a place where Paul uses archons to refer to demons? I mean, given the evidence that we have, I think it's more likely that he's referring to human rulers, because the other time that he uses the word, he's clearly referring to human rulers. So,
So he's unaware of Pilate. He's unaware of the specific rulers involved.
well, just because he doesn't name them doesn't mean he's unaware of them.
It'd be the perfect opportunity to name them to show that he knows this stuff.
Why should he name them?
To
To
show that
show
he
that he
knows this stuff,
knows?
he's trying to get credibility. He's trying to say, no, I know as much as the rest. So the only reason he wouldn't be specific about that is, and don't forget, this became a major point of dogma later on. They got very insistent about pinning Pilate to everything. Almost as if they wanted a historical character to make their story stronger. But don't forget, if this is the message that all the other apostles are bringing out, then it means Paul is going along with them and just doing the vague archons word. So why would he not be more specific? It's very unlikely, unless, of course, he's not being specific because there is no specific person who killed
I
Jesus.
think you're making a lot of assumptions here, honestly.
I'm
Like,
just pointing out the balance on the
I
two
mean,
sides. So if you ignore the other side, you can say, well, this proves my point. But then if you look at both sides, if both sides are equal on an argument, then it doesn't go in either favor. And if one side is stronger than the other. So in this particular case, being vague about vague demons, archons, or something that can be used in either direction is not a very strong point in favor of a historical Jesus. Because if there was a historical Jesus, there would be some key points in history where there was a significant event that Paul would know about. And we would know some details. We'd know where, we'd know who, we'd know when. As it is, Paul is extremely vague, as if he's getting these from visions, which is what he explicitly says. I only get this information from visions. Now, we know that's not true. We know Paul's lying because he joined the cult after it started. And he clearly doesn't actually have clairvoyant powers. So he obviously got the story from, presumably from when he was talking about interrogating Christians and persecuting them and so on. So he learned about
mhm.
these beliefs of the cult from that phase of his life. and then took that in and managed to take over arms of the cult when he decided, possibly from a guilty conscience, it's a bit uncertain, or possibly just from realizing that he had the intelligence and the background knowledge to be able to make this his own. So one way or another, he took over. So if he
Okay.
had a historical Jesus on which to base all of these bits of knowledge, then the rest of them would be throwing this at him and saying, we know all these details about Jesus because we were there. We knew him. We know all these background details that you don't know. And yet there's none of that. He never has to respond to that. He never makes an argument or even an explanation as to why he doesn't know all these details. It's as if the others don't know these details either.
I don't know about that. I mean,
Well,
I
so you
just
can
don't think
interpret it either way.
that.
That's my point.
I mean, the thing is, like, he's like everybody knows that he didn't actually, know Jesus while Jesus was alive. So, like, why would they be, uh, why would they be throwing stuff at him? Throwing like, the fact that he doesn't know certain details, like, certain details about Jesus' life, where he grew up, or anything like that. Like, why would they? Paul's the
So
spiritual leader. Like,
you don't think anything Jesus said or did was important to the cult.
what? I don't
So
think anything Jesus
if
said
he's
or did
only
was
talking
important
about,
to the whole.
so if Paul never has to respond to any accusations that he doesn't know what Jesus said when he was alive, then you're only going by things that Jesus said in visions after he was dead, or secret messages in scripture, and that's all the other apostles were using, and that's all Paul was using. It seems very odd.
Jesus' teachings were passed down through the Christian communities. In
Well,
fact,
how do you know that?
Paul references Jesus' teachings on three separate occasions, actually,
Do you
in
have
the
an example
scriptures.
of that?
Yes, I can give you all
Did
three
you say
examples.
in
Well,
the
the first one,
scriptures?
yeah. Well, I'm in Paul's letters. Um, the first one is when, well, I mean, I don't know if you would consider this a teaching, but um, institution of the Eucharist. This is my body, this is my blood, all of that. That's
Oh,
in
the one he received in a
yeah.
vision. Yeah. So I
Oh,
suspect that that
received
was
in a vision.
already a cult. Um, so I suspect that was already a cult ritual, and he was validating it, probably due to accusations of copying it off Dionysus and mysteries or something like that. But
Well,
it's one of those
he
ones
says
where he says he
Jesus.
received it in the same way that
Uh,
he received all his other visions.
well, he says Jesus said this, that Jesus did this on the night that he was betrayed, or the night that he was handed over.
Yeah, handed
So
over by
he's
God.
referring to a specific. He's talking about a specific night.
Yeah, and
He's
no, he's unaware of Judas. He doesn't know anyone else is there. He's getting all of this in a vision. It's just Jesus on
okay.
his own.
Uh, well, he's Jesus is talking to somebody when he says,
Yeah,
this
to
is.
Paul, to the Christians. This is
He
Paul's
says
point.
on
He's
the night
teaching
that
this as
and the
theology.
night that Jesus was betrayed, or the night that Jesus was handed over.
So on the historical Jesus theory, he got this information from where?
So Paul wasn't there when Jesus was handed over, or
Exactly. So as he says, he received it in a vision, the same way he receives all of his visions.
and he says that it happened, that this is something that happened at a specific night, and this is a specific night that Paul wasn't there for. So
Yeah,
if
the
Jesus is
theological
talking to
point
somebody,
is
then it follows that Jesus' followers would have been there while he was talking to them, and
they're not
not only
there.
that, but
The
Paul
story.
Paul refers to it as a supper. He does refer to it as a supper.
Yes,
He
that's
says
right, because it's a
after
ritual.
supper.
Yeah, it's a ritual meal. So the point is that this has to be the last thing Jesus does before being killed, because it's a ritual. It's a theological point he's making, and as Paul explicitly likes to say, he got these from visions and scripture. There's nowhere where he says, "Oh, Peter told me this the other day."
Yeah, but we both agree that Paul is lying, that he did get it from the
Well,
actual
about the
Christians.
meal, maybe not. It depends on the origin of the meal. Is Paul starting a tradition, or is Paul validating an existing tradition? And we don't know the answer to that.
Okay, so he's all right. Well, if he's starting a tradition, why does like who is Jesus talking to in this scenario, in this vision? Who is Jesus talking to? Because he says that this happened in the past. He says it was on the night that he was handed over. So Jesus can't be talking to Paul because Paul isn't there. So I don't
Exactly.
understand
That's how you know it's
what you think
just
this
a
is about.
theological thing. It's a supernatural thing, because Paul is validating the ritual and saying, no, this ritual is a good thing, and this is why it's important, and he's giving some theological backing to this ritual. So
Okay, but
the setting makes sense.
the scene doesn't make sense though that you're suggesting. It just doesn't make sense because
I don't think scenes
Jesus
and
is talking
visions,
to somebody who's not there. You have Jesus
just like,
talking to somebody
yeah,
who's not
just
there.
like
Not only
every other
that, but
conversation in a dream.
not only that, but Paul says in the same way he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant." Blah blah blah. So after supper, I mean, so what? Did Jesus just have a meal by himself and
And
in
Paul
this
was the first to find out about it.
ethereal realm? I mean,
Exactly. So
it just
the
seems like
context
a
is,
bizarre thing. Like it doesn't seem like a natural reading. The natural reading seems to be that he's portraying Jesus sitting with other people and having a meal with them because he says, after supper. I mean, it's a supper, and he's talking to them. So I mean,
if you ignore how Paul says he got the information, then yeah, you could go down that road. But then he's obviously repeating stuff that he got from the other apostles. If you assume it was from a real event, in which case it's very odd that none of the apostles are at the event.
why are you saying that none of the apostles were at the event?
Paul only mentions Jesus talking to the camera. Basically, there's no one else there,
Camera.
no conversations that
What?
happen.
I read it as Jesus talking to the apostles, even though it doesn't explicitly say the apostles. It
That's what it
seems
was turned into later in the Gospels. So if you read the Gospels first and then you import that into Paul, and then you're forgetting that the Gospels were written after Paul, and it was Paul's story that was used to make that event in the Gospels. So you're probably starting with a preconception there of an actual meal with an actual Jesus and his friends. But no, there's no
well,
Judas
maybe
story.
I'm starting with a preconception, but I think that if I just take what it says here, it seems odd to me that Jesus would be talking to nobody in this scene.
Everything about
He would-
these visions
he
is
wouldn't be
odd.
talking. I think that's kind of dismissive, honestly. I mean,
So
I think
do
we
you
have to
accept that
consider
Paul used
whether
visions?
like how it's supposed to be read. What?
Do you accept that Paul uses visions as his source?
Sometimes, but I also accept, and you accept, and you've agreed that Paul has gotten information from other Christians, and that he's just not really owning up to it.
Yeah, so is Paul reminding people of something that they've already been taught by the other apostles, or something that's already gone around, or is this something
Maybe,
new that he's bringing to them?
I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to tell.
So we got two
But
options,
so that's
at
that's
least
the
two
first
options anyway.
that's the first instance. I mentioned that I had three examples of Paul referencing teachings from Jesus. So I think we're just gonna have to disagree on that one because I just think that that's an awkward reading of the passage. But I mean,
I
that's
think
all
it
I
would be
can say.
really awkward to have that one handed down and have an entire meal with nobody else there and just Jesus. This is a very odd way of saying things, especially when he's talking about receiving it.
What? And that's what you're claiming that Jesus had an entire meal by himself. That
I'm just repeating what Paul said. He received this in the
uh-huh.
same way that he receives his visions.
Okay. And I already agreed that I don't think that Paul is being honest about this. But
It's entirely possible that he's lying, but where does that leave us? Paul lying?
all right.
This is your solid source for Jesus, a man who you know is a liar.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but the thing is, he's also, and I'll get to this in some of my other examples, but uh, not all of this is simply claims that Paul's making. A lot of it is actually just him, using information that is already familiar to the Christian communities. in
Yeah, it's
order to
based
make
on
a point,
hearsay,
you
basically,
know?
is what we're working with. We don't have a
Okay.
first-hand account. We have
Yeah.
an account of someone else's account, and that's a very sort of wishy-washy as to how he explains things. The silence, for example, if you take only a few pieces of Paul and you cherry pick them out that suggest maybe there was a Jesus there, and you ignore all of Paul that doesn't mention a Jesus when mentioning something that Jesus said or did, would have been the clincher in the argument, would have really supported Paul's case. So if
Like
you
when?
ignore all of the other evidence, then it looks like it leans slightly towards Jesus existing. But then you
Can
put
you
the
give me
rest
an
of Paul
example of
back
that,
in,
though?
just the
Where
silence of Paul.
we're
So
mentioning Jesus, we're mentioning Jesus, some specific detail about Jesus' earthly life would have been a clincher in Paul's argument. Can
well,
you give an example of that?
he uses really convoluted arguments. I think Galatians was one, but I
Because
forget the
I've
exact
heard the
argument.
argument. I've heard the argument against apologists that it seems strange that Paul doesn't mention an empty tomb, and I would agree with that. But I mean, I'm not claiming that there was an empty tomb, so
Well,
I don't.
Paul
Wasn't
believed in resurrection, so that's fair enough. I mean, there doesn't need to have been an empty tomb story yet.
it? Okay.
If you go
Um,
what would typically have happened, it would have been a mass grave, and they would have just dumped the body in there, and then no one would be able to
yeah.
tell the difference. Plus,
Yeah.
in the story with Judas having to identify Jesus as if he was some sort of nobody, then you wouldn't expect to be able to produce a body and go, "That's definitely the guy," or anything like that. So we don't need to do the empty tomb thing. I don't think that makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's the only time that I'm just saying that that's the only time that I've ever heard um, somebody give the argument that Paul not mentioning uh, some detail about Jesus' earthly life is, strange because him doing that would have been the clincher of an argument. Like him talking about Jesus' resurrection, mentioning the empty tomb would have been ideal for that, for instance. You know, and so that's the only example that I can think of where,
It
yeah,
depends on how
because
much
you
credence
you
you
said
give
that.
to the gospel story. So if you think
Mm,
of like the Beatitudes or anything like that, anything that Jesus said in the Gospels, and then you go back and look at Paul's arguments, there are times where if Jesus had genuinely said any of the things that he'd said in his parables and speeches, Paul using that would have been way more effective than him doing these really convoluted theological arguments based on ancient pieces of scripture. He could have just said, Jesus said this, therefore this is what we do. But he never does that.
um, well, actually, he does, and that would be
Except in visions, of course, and
actually.
scripture.
Well, I want to move on to my next example because I told you I had three examples,
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
and yeah. So the next one I think is kind of interesting, and I'd like to hear your response to it. It's it's 1 Corinthians 7:10-12, where Jesus talks about marriage and divorce, or Paul references Jesus' teaching on marriage and divorce. 1 Corinthians 7:10-12. So here we go. All right. So he says in verse 10, it says, "To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord." All right. And then in 12 he says, "To the rest I say, not I, not the Lord." Yeah, so he distinguishes, to the rest I say, "I, not the Lord."
Yeah, it's interesting that he's using the title
So
there,
he
which is
distinguishes
God slash
he
Jesus.
distinguishes between things that Jesus said and things that he's saying. Now, if
Yep.
he's just getting everything from visions, then why wouldn't he just say, yeah, I mean, why would he make that distinction then? Why wouldn't he just say Jesus said all of this stuff? And even in verse
Well, as
25.
with any con artist, it adds some credibility if you mix a bit of truth in with the lies. But
And,
don't forget there were
okay.
other apostles doing this too. So if he contradicts them too clearly, or if he makes a claim that's a little bit too extreme, then he's going to be even more conflict with them. So you need to toe the party line, so to speak. But obviously, if you're going to be going around claiming that Jesus is talking to you in visions, which we know Paul did, then you can't go around saying literally everything I say is straight from Jesus, because people will probably lynch you at that point.
I honestly don't think that that there would be much of an issue with that. I think that
I think you should try
a
it. Tell
lot of
people that what you ordered for breakfast is a gift from God, and see how they
ordered
take
for
that.
breakfast. Well, I'm not talking about mundane things like that. I'm talking about Paul teaching people and giving, relaying teachings and instructions, religious, things that he would need. I mean, he wouldn't need to tell people that, he got from the Lord what he had for breakfast. I mean,
Yeah,
but
so this could actually be a point for saying that Paul was genuine. If he genuinely was having these hallucinations, rather than just lying about it to make a profit, because people are very divided on the honesty of Paul. If he was a genuine believer, then he would well have said, "Oh, this message is from me, but this is one I got in a vision." So that makes perfect sense.
yeah,
It's just interesting to see how you determine what he got from visions in scripture, which is what Paul claims, and then what you think he got from other sources, which Paul denies.
what other sources? What are you talking about?
Well, where Paul says, "I didn't get this from any other man,"
Okay.
which on your scenario would be a lie because Paul never met Jesus, so he can't have been relaying stuff directly from Jesus unless you go down the whole vision road, which leaves you in a bit of a bind there.
So in verse 25, he also again says, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So yeah, that's the example that I have, and I just
Yeah,
think that
literally any con artist can do that.
I agree that they can. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I just think that it kind of tips the scale in favor of historicity.
Well, so
Having
so we
him
both agree that
make this distinction. And also, like I said before, it seems like he's referring uh, to commands and sayings that the Christian community was already familiar with. He's not saying, "Oh, and guess what? Jesus said this." He's saying, that.
no, he says the Lord imparted this to me, and things like that. See, if he'd been going by historical Jesus, which we know he never met, then he would say, Paul told me that Jesus said this, or someone wrote down, or oral tradition says, or something along those lines. But instead, he very is very careful not to put himself in that position of relying on anyone else. He's very careful to make it directly from God through visions, or directly from God through Scripture, or the Holy Spirit. And
Mm,
using all these supernatural sources, which in that particular context at the time gave him more credibility because people used to genuinely believe that you could hear voices and that would be coming from the gods.
yeah. Well, what I mentioned about Paul seems to be referring to things that were already well known in the Christian community, sayings of Jesus that were already well known. I think a good example of that is actually 1 Corinthians 9:14, which says, where he's talking about missionaries receiving financial support from you know people who they're ministering to and stuff like that. And so in verse 14 he says, in the same way the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So he seems to be just kind of referencing this like they should already know it.
Oh
Doesn't it
yeah,
seem
it's
like
not
that?
surprising that cults have been spreading the message that you should pay the preacher. That's pretty much the staple of all
Yeah,
cults,
that's not
isn't
what
it?
I'm saying. I'm saying it seems like he's referring to a saying of the Lord that was already well known in these Christian communities.
So you think
So,
Jesus said that you should pay your preacher just before being executed for sedition, and that was passed down through Peter and made it to Paul, and then
wait,
Paul
what?
passed that on?
Not what I said. In
So you're saying that
the
this is a
same way the
saying of
Lord commanded
Jesus.
that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living from the gospel. It's just talking about missionaries receiving financial support from those who they minister to. And this teaching is also recorded in the Gospels, and when Jesus says, when Jesus talks about, not taking anything with you, receiving, like if you're preaching in a town,
Neither purse nor
be
scrip.
dependent on the people who, who are offering, shelter and food and things like that for
Yeah,
you.
don't take a staff, don't take sandals, all that stuff.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
is, of course, the Gospels, which were based on Paul, so could easily have gotten it from there.
Well, it's not based on Paul because it's something that Paul didn't specify that he didn't write that quote. So I think that
I
this
think we
points
can
to an
give
oral
the
tradition.
I think we can give the Gospel authors the ability to create new ideas. I think they were quite good at that.
Sure, but they also do preserve some oral traditions, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of scholars.
I suspect
So
that paying the
anyway,
cult leaders and paying the preachers and so on isn't something that originated with Christianity. I'm pretty sure that happens in all cults.
okay. I mean, that doesn't really matter.
And saying that it's from whichever deity you worship at the time just makes it a little bit stronger. If they're believers in the cult, then they're more likely to give you the money.
All right. Well, I mean, that doesn't really go
It's
against my
not very
point.
good, is it? It's the kind of thing that literally every cult is going to say. So saying that this particular phrase, out of all the ones that don't date back to a
Not every
historical Jesus,
cult is
just this
not
one
every
goes back to
cult is
him.
going to say, don't take your don't take your staff and your bag, your money bag, and things like that.
Yeah, that was a bit of an
And not
insane
not
thing to
all
say.
cults have missionaries, you know.
Well,
So
that was based on potentially it was not literal, um, given the way that Mark tends to write.
all right. Well, anyway, we were talking earlier about or we started discussing the rulers of this age.
Yep.
And I think that it's all right. We could go back to that.
Well, so should we discuss any of the other discrepancies? So you've been talking about points that may lean in favor of there being a Jesus at some point. But what about all the other passages that go in the opposite direction?
Okay. So do you want to bring up any?
So just literally all of Paul, where he doesn't mention anything about Jesus saying, doing, being anywhere. So you've got all these gaps where it would have been perfect for Paul to mention this if it happened. So we know that the preservation of these letters happens
So can you
through.
give me an example of where it would be perfect for Paul to mention something if it happened?
I haven't got one off the top of my head, but I will go look one up.
Okay.
This is not very interesting to watch, though, so you should probably add something else.
Okay. So let me just go to the Corinthians passage 2:8. All right. So in 1 Corinthians 2:8, actually I'm gonna go back to 2:6. So Paul says he talks about wisdom. He says, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away."
Yep,
So
that would definitely
he's
apply to the demons.
contrasting, and he uses the same word for rulers of this age, archons of this ion or whatever, that he uses in verse 8. And I think that in this verse, it's pretty clear that he's talking about human rulers because he's making this contrast between the spiritual wisdom and the earthly, worldly wisdom. I mean, Paul all the time he likes to hate on the earthly wisdom and everything like that. So I think it's pretty clear that he's talking about humans here. So you still think he's talking about demons in
Well,
verse
when
6.
he's talking about the rulers of this age passing away, that's That's not news to anyone who's talking about humans, because they know humans die. Humans die all the time. But if you're talking about an apocalyptic
Well, he says that
message
the
where
world is
the
going to pass
demons will
away
all
too.
die, yeah, exactly. Like the whole world will pass away, and the demons will have their due. They'll all be cast into hell. I don't know if hell had quite made it into their theology at that point. But he's talking about the death of the rulers of this age, which could be either human rulers or it could be, the entire demonic forces. Because don't forget, Paul's message is very apocalyptic. He's preaching the end of the world is nigh, and seems to think it will happen in his own lifetime.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. So, and he's referring to that here. Like, he's talking about the end of the world. He's talking about, human rulers passing away. He's not talking about specific human rulers passing away, which is why it's not mundane or unremarkable for him to say, that humans are passing away because humans die all the time. No, he's saying all humans are going to pass away. The rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. He's saying that there will be a point in the future where the human rulers will all be gone. They'll pass away. All the humans will die. All the human rulers will die. So,
Which is hardly news, because everyone knew that already. But it makes more
not
sense in
really,
a
not
theological
really
sense.
though.
They didn't know that humans would die.
Not all humans. I mean, that's a claim that not everybody agrees with. Not everybody thinks that all humans are going to die at some point in the future. There's going to be an apocalypse, and
No,
eventually
but
humans are
he's
going
not
to go
talking about
extinct.
the rulers of the next ages and the next ages after that. He's talking about the rulers of this age now.
Yes. Okay. So he's making a claim about the near future. So he's saying that this age, whatever that means, is going to end soon.
Yep, which
Is
is
that what you're
either
saying?
or.
Yeah. Well,
It's
I would agree
entirely
with that.
possible that that time he was talking about human rulers. It's also possible he was still talking about the demonic powers, because obviously the wisdom of this age is very much the idea that human rulers are being manipulated by demons, which is a very apocalyptic sort of message.
I don't really think that it's a very straightforward reading to say that he's referring to the wisdom of demons, because I don't think that there's any tradition or any motif in early Christian thought that demons have a certain wisdom or something like that. I mean, demons, possess people. They cause all kinds of trouble and stuff, but they don't. There aren't demon philosophers. I mean, the demons uh, aren't going around establishing schools of thought. I mean, that's humans doing that. You know, like when he's talking about when he talks about how he has a problem with like human wisdom, how human wisdom is not as good as the wisdom of God and stuff. He's referring to these other religions, these other philosophies, these other schools of thought that
Yeah,
it's a
which in
human
a cult
thing.
mentality, you're supposed to think that our particular cult is right. We're the ones that are actually connected to the god, like the real god, and everyone else is outside of that circle. Everyone else is being controlled by the demonic powers, the rulers of this age, the Archons, and so on. It still actually happens today with Christians, where they think that everyone else is a Satanist.
I don't think that Paul or most Christians today think that uh, everyone who disagrees with them is possessed by the devil. I mean,
It's even in the Old
I'm
Testament
sure
where
some Christians think that, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, that seems like an extraordinary claim
goes
to
right
make.
back to the Old Testament as well, where God's destroying the wisdom of the wise.
Okay, the wisdom of the wise, yeah,
Yeah, just the
referring to
whole concept
humans.
that anyone outside of their cult is therefore controlled by other forces. And in the Old Testament, it does actually mention other gods fairly regularly.
Yes, but when it says destroying the wisdom of the wise, that's referring to humans, right?
Is it?
Yes. I mean that seems to be the straightforward reading. I mean, do you have any
but
reason to think that it's not?
if it's the wisdom that God gave them, then that's very foolish. But if you're talking about people who are outside of their circle, outside of their cult, for example, then that makes perfect sense to say, well, they're being controlled by other powers than God because they're not under God.
Not really, because just because somebody isn't following, the God that you believe is the one true God, doesn't mean that they're controlled by demons.
Don't underestimate how paranoid cultists are. But I think we're off topic at this
Okay.
point.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that that's an assumption that isn't really, and you know, even if you're right, even if they have that view that everyone who's not a Christian is therefore possessed by demons, then uh,
Not necessarily
that still
possessed,
that
but
still
influenced,
doesn't
you would
that
say.
still actually kind of goes with my argument, because that's still demons doing something with humans. That's still using humans. So the rulers of this age, who are doomed to pass away. I mean, yeah, the wisdom of this age, or the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. So even if rulers of this age referred to human rulers who are controlled by. I mean, I'm sure that the Christians believed, like, if they believe that all non-Christians are possessed by demons, and they believe that the ones who crucified Jesus were possessed by demons.
I think possessed
Pontius
is a bit.
Pilate was possessed by a demon.
I
The
wouldn't say
Romans were
possessed.
possessed by
I'd say
demons, right?
influenced. So it's usually considered to
Okay,
be more subtle.
influence.
Possession is a very specific thing, like epilepsy, or um,
Uh-huh.
that's a very specific kind of control. But it's usually supposed to be more subtle than that. That they're being influenced to move away from God, and they either have to repent or burn, or that kind of thing.
Okay. I mean, I don't really see any evidence that Paul holds that view.
Well, so
He doesn't
for
really talk much
example,
about demons.
later on, yeah, so Satan was a bit more developed. His character came along a little bit better in the
Mm,
later Christian writings. So you can see the seeds of this in Paul's work, where he's kind of got this nebulous idea that there's two sides in a war, and that Jesus has been killed by one side, and he's on the other side. But it doesn't really take proper flesh until you get onto the actual creation of Satan, or the adoption of an existing angel.
mm.
The adversary, um, which is used later on in their theology. So this is kind of in the infancy of their theology. They've got, what, 20 years after the beginning of the cult, roughly. I mean, it's a bit of an estimate, but
Mm,
this is still fairly early days.
yeah. Well, um, so I think that the viewers watching will be able to distinguish, which reading of the verse sounds more natural, and which reading sounds a little bit more stretched. Like, because I think that
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
the natural reading of this is that. And I mean, do you agree at least that when like, if Paul is referring to humans in verse 6, when he says the rulers of this age, if he's referring to humans in verse 6, then he is also referring to humans in verse 8.
I'll have to go back and have a closer look at it, I think.
Okay.
But
And
the thing I
and
think is the
conversely, if
problem with
he's
this
referring to
is
demons in verse 6, then he's also referring to demons in verse 8. So,
potentially I need to go back over it. But the thing is, it's clearly ambiguous the way he uses these phrases, and also even if he did mean in this particular case earthly rulers, that doesn't necessarily mean that he always uses it in the same sense. One of the problems we have is the very small sample size of
mhm.
Paul's words, and just trying to figure out the way that Paul uses words, which isn't necessarily the same as other usages of the same word elsewhere. There's a lot of interpretation that goes into these things. So it's very difficult unless someone's being explicit. Like, for example, if he named some of the rulers, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe
unfortunately,
he did. Maybe they cut it out.
so another verse that I kind of just want to hear your opinion on is Romans 15:8, when Paul says that Christ became a servant to the circumcised, because that seems to me a very clear reference to Jesus having an earthly ministry, and uh, that, I mean, the circumcised obviously refers to Jews, the Jewish people. And so
Yeah, absolutely. The cult started to be started as a Jewish cult with only
okay.
Jews in it, based on Jewish scripture. And then what Paul is trying to do is take that and move it into Gentile territory, because there's loads of untapped wealth there. I think would be
Yes.
the way of looking at that.
But this verse seems to be indicating that Jesus had a public ministry that he ministered to the Jewish people.
That he became a servant of the Jews by dying.
By dying? I don't
That's
think
specifically what
that
he is the servant
doesn't
as.
seem like um,
The suffering servant, literally from Isaiah.
okay. Yeah, but the servant isn't a servant because he's suffering. He's a servant and he's suffering.
So that you don't get the actual servant narrative until
And
later on in the
if
Gospels with the
Paul,
feet
I mean,
washing stuff.
you mentioned that Paul was trying to bring the message to the Gentiles and everything. So why would he say Christ became a servant to the circumcised if he believes that Jesus died for everyone, including the
He's
Gentiles?
going to have a really hard time from concealing that, isn't he? Saying this Jewish cult here that started with Jews and is mostly Jews. Yeah, it didn't start with the Jews, honest.
Well, I'm just talking about
He's
this
going to
one.
have to admit it.
I'm talking about the interpretation of this sentence because it seems to make more sense that Paul's referring to Jesus' earthly ministry, since that was focused on Jews. It wasn't.
So,
He
in
didn't
what way do you
minister
think
to
he
Gentiles
served?
in his public ministry.
So, no mention of any of it, no
Jewish people.
details. Literally,
No,
just he served by dying.
no, he served by teaching to them, by
Where
preaching
does
to
it
them.
say that? Are you reading that into the text, or is
No,
it in?
that's what seems to be the natural reading of the text. That he's talking about his public ministry because he says to the circumcised, and if he was referring to Jesus' death, then he wouldn't be saying to the circumcised.
Don't forget, he explicitly says Jesus came first for the Jews and then for the Gentiles. This is the same sentiment.
I disagree.
You don't think he came for the Jews first?
Well, I don't think that really makes the sentence make sense the way that you're reading it.
So, what greater thing? How can you serve someone better than to lay down your life for them? That's also a passage in the Bible.
I wouldn't use the word. I don't think that's a very good usage of the word servant. I mean, I think that servant kind of has connotations of an ongoing and active thing that you're doing, not just like a one-time thing, but like, oh, you do this for a while, kind of a thing.
What makes you say that?
That's just.
Don't forget, this is the same way that Mark phrased it. So Mark picked up on this meaning in Paul, this theological meaning of the last being first, the first being last, that the master would come down and serve. That was very much a meaning that Mark picked up on, and the serving itself was by dying. So there's no lasting effect.
I don't think that Mark just meant dying.
So if he came to serve the uncircumcised first and then move on to the Gentiles, then that definitely doesn't mean anything in his ministry, because that was only in Judea. And then you only got the one mention in one gospel about a dog that he's serving a Canaanite woman or something. So if you're talking about serving and then saying first for the Jews and then for the Gentiles, then that definitely doesn't make sense in that reading. It only makes sense if the serving itself was the sacrifice, which can be handed on later, that can be handed on to the Jews and then on to the Gentiles. If you're just talking about physically going to someone's house and giving them a hand, then it's never reaching the Gentiles. That's only serving the Jews. And only one specific Jew at that time, It's also inconsistent with Paul's theology.
I just wanted to hear your interpretation of that. So,
yeah, I should say this is all off the top of my head because I've not got reference materials in front of me right now, and I didn't want to slow things down by looking stuff up. So what we should do is post comments underneath for things that we couldn't think of at the time, just underneath the video on the Facebook group. That make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's always fun when you bring up something that I can't think of on the spot. Then that's great because I can expand my knowledge and I can go and do further research, which is the whole point of these discussions, is to flesh out ideas, come up with new concepts that we hadn't thought of before, and go and do further research to get some progress out of it.
Mm. So another passage that I wanted to bring up is Galatians 4:4.
Classic.
Yeah. So when Paul says he was born of a woman, born under the law, born under the law means that Jesus was a Jew.
I think you could say that just means mortal. That's pretty much what the whole point of the law is, that you can die. Is that if you're an eternal being, if you're immortal, then you're not under the law, because obviously you're higher than that in the outer heavens.
But the law
As
is
soon as
referring
you
to the law of
go,
Moses, right?
the law's
You
referring to
agree
what?
that the law is referring to the law of Moses.
Yeah, absolutely, which includes death.
What? Includes death? What? What are you talking
So
about?
going right back to
The
Genesis.
law of Moses refers to, keeping kosher and, the Sabbath and, the holidays and, all the rules and stuff. That's the law
Yeah,
of
so
Moses.
if you're not susceptible to sin, then you can't die, according to the Old Testament theology. It was the sin specifically that allowed for death. So in the narrative, Jesus takes on the sins and then dies. So he has to be susceptible to that.
Okay, the sins. All right, but I mean, we're talking about the law.
Exactly. And the whole
So
point of the law is sin. That's the entire subject of it.
he said he was born under the law. So he's talking about
Absolutely.
his birth. He's not talking about his death. You said that he takes on the sins, yeah, in his death, okay?
Yeah, so
Not in
to
his
be
birth.
able to take on sins, to be able to die, he has to have a mortal body. That makes sense. Yeah, you have to, if you're
Okay.
an angel and you need to take on flesh. So regardless of whether you do historical Jesus or mythical Jesus, the theology still ends up the same, which is a deity takes on a mortal body, comes under the law effectively, and is then killed and then escapes as the deity again, is raised as the deity. So no matter how you look at this, going under the law specifically means preparing to die.
Um, it means preparing to die under the
Yeah,
law.
so if
I
Jesus
mean,
is
I don't,
immortal, he can't
I
die.
don't see how you make that connection though.
This is the theology of it. So if you don't just look at what Paul's doing, if you take what Paul's theology grew into, you can work back and see how it started as the roots. And also, if you look at his source material, if you look at the Old Testament, you can see that the whole theology around death and the law is to be under the law, is to be able to die, is to be mortal, is to be human. All of this is wrapped up into one package.
Can you give any verses that support that?
Sure, let me have a look. For the wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23.
Okay, but that's not talking about the law.
The law is about sin.
I'm talking about. I'm talking about. Well, linking the law to mortality. So wait. So what?
No,
What
that goes back to
exactly is your claim?
Genesis.
That
That goes back
the
to
that the law
breaking.
that when so you're basically saying that when Paul says born under the law, he's just referring to being mortal.
So there could be more subtle theology to it than that, but in the basic sense, yes.
Um, I mean that just seems like a big stretch, honestly. And
In your version of this, then, if Paul is
mhm,
explicitly making a point about being born under the law, what does that mean to you? What does that mean in the case of a
it means
historical
being
Jesus?
born a Jew.
Yeah,
He
so
was a
the
Jew.
point is it needs to be a Jewish sacrifice because it's the Jewish religion and all that. And Matthew makes this point much later where he wants Jesus to be completely kosher, doesn't he? He wants to keep him entirely in line with the laws.
Okay.
You've also got the incentive from the prophecy to say this is the Davidic heir. So you definitely need that body to be Jewish and circumcised for him to be in the line of David officially.
Okay.
So you can get all of this from prophecies and things that aren't even prophecies that are being used as prophecies. And you can see why Paul is making this theological point, but it doesn't get you anywhere near like a physical person that Paul never met that this is supposed to be evidence for. It doesn't really make
Well,
sense
I mean,
except as theology.
if you're gonna bring up the prophecy, then I mean, like the prophecies were interpreted as referring to a human. He would be who would be a human descendant of David, and there were things about him being a ruler and establishing world peace and things like that. So the expectation was of a human, ruler. So like you agree with that, right? That was
Um,
the
Sorry, I
expectation.
was reading something else. I was just looking at what the Christian theology like of modernity is to be under the law. And there's an article by Matt Slick, who I don't consider a proper theologian, but he's pointing
Uh,
out that to be under the law means to be able to be subject to sin, which leads down the road to sin is death. And yeah, it's the theology is still the same from Christians. It hasn't changed since Paul's day on that one. So sorry, what was it you were saying?
yeah. I was saying that it seems the messianic prophecies point to a human ruler who is expected. The expectation was that the Messiah would be human, who would be a physical
Paul's
human
Jesus
on
was human.
earth. Okay, but he doesn't die on earth. So he's human, but he doesn't die on earth.
Now, so in order to be a sacrifice, he has to have a mortal body, and I guess Paul's perspective is, well, humans are the important ones. But
Uh,
it should also fit in with the whole Davidic hair and everything. But yeah, he has to be mortal to die. You can't just sacrifice an angel if you're going to go, well, they're all eternal, immortal beings. And you've got to do the whole blood thing as well, where they're obsessed with blood covenants. So Paul's Jesus is human. So this is what I
there
meant
was
about.
no messianic expectation for there to be a sacrifice like that, like death on the cross or any other death. That wasn't part of the uh, messianic prophecies.
I
There
agree.
aren't any
It wasn't
messianic
originally part of
prophecies
the
about
prophecy.
that.
Yeah, you're right.
So
But then,
how did that develop then? Because
so
that's
this,
completely contrary to Jewish thought. That the Messiah would end up dying, and because the prophecies are talking about the Messiah conquering the enemies of Israel and establishing an everlasting kingdom and everything like that. So it seems like if you're going to make up a Messiah, then you wouldn't make up one who would be crucified.
what happened to all the conquering messiahs? They all got killed.
Yeah, well,
So,
they weren't. I mean, they weren't like if you're going to make up a Messiah, why wouldn't you make up a Messiah that is that doesn't die at all? Like that seems to be more in line with the Jewish thought.
well, let's explain this from two different perspectives. One from the historical Jesus and one from the mythical Jesus. On the historical Jesus viewpoint, you've got a Messiah. So say let's you go for the military leader one and you go down your approach of him being killed by the Romans. Your Messiah has been killed. You then have to rationalize that in some way. So then they turn it into well, this was a metaphorical victory. This was and then they go down the road that they went down.
Yeah,
If you're going to do this from the celestial Jesus version, then what you do is you see all the other messiahs that have been slaughtered and destroyed by the Romans, and then you do that same exact turning point. So regardless of whether Jesus existed or not, you've still got the same. Um, the conspiracy theory psychology where they have this epiphany where they think that they found a secret, that the only one in the world who's realized this amazing truth, and everyone else is delusional, and they're the one who've got this right. And this is what you got with Peter. So with the original originator of this, he has this moment where he's reading through scriptures trying to figure out why is it we keep getting crushed under these Romans? Why is it that the temple cult is so corrupt? And he finds this way of rationalizing altogether and saying, okay, God can still be God if this is his plan all along. And if this victory is a spiritual victory, not a military victory, as all these failed messiahs have shown, we can then invent a new messiah who never has to be killed by the Romans because he never has to exist. He can only be killed in the celestial realm, which means the Romans can't get to him. And this is a spiritual victory, which means we can get away from the temple cult, we can justify everything, we can begin this new and if he's a genuine believer, then he's going to think he has actually found a secret. The same way flat earthers think, oh, I found this secret that shows that the earth is really flat and everyone else is delusional. So regardless of whether a historical Jesus existed or not, they both end up going down that same path. Repeated failed military messiahs lead you down to either rejecting the whole thing or finding a way around it and finding a new path to take. And the path that Christianity took was to say it's a metaphorical or a celestial victory, isn't it? Just to say it's a triumph over sin, not a triumph over Rome.
So your view about what inspired the whole death and resurrection thing is that it was inspired by the previous messiahs that were killed for claiming to be messiahs?
I'd say maybe not inspired so much, but maybe frustrated with the failures of this Messiah to turn up. Because all of the, don't forget the dating that they're doing from Daniel, for example, they're expecting it to be about around the 1st century AD, and I think around the 30s-ish. So you hit that point, and you're waiting for this Messiah to come, and he still doesn't come. You're going to have to find a way to rationalize that, because the alternative is to say God is a failure. And you know what Christians don't like doing that at all.
Uh-huh.
So they will find a way to rationalize what's happening, and they will find a way to find hidden messages in scripture, which they still do to this day. They're still trying to find end of the world and predicting it and all that shit. So they are finding a way to rationalize this. So regardless of whether Jesus existed or not, this path still remains the same. The theology goes down this road of a suffering savior Messiah.
Well, I just don't really see how that would have had that result. So previous Messiah figures who were killed, who revolted and were killed, why would that cause somebody to invent a Messiah who was also killed?
Well, if they were an idiot, they could keep doing failure after failure after failure, but the smart ones will eventually figure out an alternative route.
So why don't? It just seems more. It just doesn't seem plausible to me that they would have, if they were going to invent a deity, that they would have invented if they were going to invent a Messiah, that they would have invented one that was killed like all the failures.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense on a historical Jesus, because so it goes down this road regardless of whether there was a historical Jesus or not. That's the point. The theology happened one way or another. There's an explanation for it because it actually happened. But to me, it makes more sense to say you can do this theologically and not have to have any of your friends tortured and killed. But it doesn't make much sense to say, oh, my friend here was killed and then we're going to just deify him. That makes no sense to me. If you've seen your friend,
well, they weren't planning it in
tortured,
advance, of course. They weren't planning it in advance. That was an unexpected turn of events. So they were following this guy, Yeshua, the street preacher. He had some really, really committed followers, and they were so committed apparently that even after he died, they wouldn't. They found a way to keep going with the movement, even though their leader had died. So
that's less likely than the alternative. Because in
how
that
is it
scenario,
less likely, though?
in that scenario, they've actually seen him die. They've actually been had their spirit crushed, and they've had to recover from that crushing blow. Whereas on the mythicist thesis, there was never that devastation. They never lost their leader like that. This was a secret message that was discovered by an existing cult leader who was looking for a way around the temple's corruption and found it. So this is a very easy one to start, because there's no death, there's no actual invasion of Romans or stoning. Because don't forget, the whole crucifixion thing could easily have just been stoning. It's the wording is a little bit vague as to that.
Really?
He could have been stoned and hung on a post. So Stauros is just a post. So after you stone someone, you hang them up as a warning. So So it doesn't necessarily have to be Roman crucifixion. It's a bit of an assumption we've tacked on later, and then they started to get all the Romans involved with the gospel stories. So in Paul's day, it wasn't crucifixion yet. So you've got the scenario where this is all a great discovery and it's wonderful, and they can go out and spread it without anyone having to die. And then you've got the alternative one, which is this powerful cult leader who was the thing holding the cult together dies horribly in front of everyone, and they know he's dead. And then this other person in the cult, Peter, picks it up and goes from there. Someone who was a follower before and now becomes the new leader and somehow
Yeah.
manages to brand them all together. I mean, it's possible, but
What's
it's
unlikely
less
about that?
likely.
I mean, you said that it would crush their spirits. Their spirits, sure, I agree, it would crush their spirits, and I think that the most effective way to deal with that would be to find a way to say that he was raised, or to believe that he was raised from the dead and that he actually won, even though he was crucified like that. That it was actually a victory, and to turn that around in that way. I think that would be
So the
the
Acts narrative, basically.
the axe narrative. What do you mean?
In the Acts narrative, they're all milling about saying, "Oh no, Jesus is dead. What are we going to do?" And they all hide. And then there's a supernatural event with tongues of fire that whips them into a frenzy and converts 3,000 people in a day. And I don't think that's plausible.
Well, I wouldn't say it would be 3,000 people. I would say, maybe a couple people who had visions and then told everyone else that, oh, hey, I saw Jesus alive. I
If
think
it's
that would be
coming from
enough.
visions, then that fits both scenarios.
Um, well, I still don't see how you think it's more plausible that they would have made up that Jesus was that their Messiah was crucified if he wasn't.
I think
Like,
it's possible in either scenario, but I think seeing someone tortured to death in front of you makes you less likely to go around telling people about it than discovering this in scripture and using it as a political move.
I mean, I I don't see.
Would
So
you really go around? So
basically,
don't forget what Paul. There's some really odd things that Paul says. Paul
mm,
says he doesn't say we preach Christ resurrected. He says we preach Christ crucified. Now, why are they
mm,
going to have to do that if everyone knows Christ was crucified? That only makes sense if he wasn't crucified and nobody knew about it until they told them this guy was crucified in visions, or he was in space or so on. If they had to say this guy was crucified by the Romans, you don't have to preach that bit. The important bit is the resurrection stuff. This guy
what do you
appeared
mean
to us
everybody
after that.
knows? Everybody wouldn't have known.
What, a
I don't
public
think I don't think
execution?
Jesus I don't think Jesus was as famous as the Gospels portray him as. I think that he had maybe a couple dozen followers.
But in your scenario, he was crucified on a hill, or he was,
A hill? No, I don't think he
or
was crucified
whichever.
on a hill. I mean, he was executed outside the city walls, so it was probably going to be I think I read that the Romans crucified people kind of like on the side of the road, so that people coming into the city would see the crosses like going into the city, you
Yeah,
know.
you could have an ignominious death for him, but that's even less likely to cause this new revival where they all go around preaching for it. I just think on
How's
balance,
that
so
likely?
it's possible in either scenario. I say it is plausible that Jesus could have been killed and his followers scattered and then somehow came back together, but I think it's more likely that this group formed without needing to be scattered in the first place. And that if you do scatter a group and crush their leadership, they're less likely to be successful than if that massacre, because it's usually not just the one guy that goes down, it's usually the group. Um, you take that bit out, it makes more sense, it's more plausible to say this group rose out of something positive rather than saying they were, horribly deprived of their leader and then somehow had the wherewithal to get back together. Because don't forget, cults of personality, there's usually just the one strong personality in the cult. It's very rare to have multiple personalities unless it gets big enough to need a hierarchy. Most of the time, you've got the one guy, the charismatic leader, the passionate one. Other people with strong personalities don't join that. They go their own way. They keep separate. It's people who are followers who come into that. So you'd have to have an outsider come in and take over the cult, or you would have to have a very rare situation in which you've got multiple strong personalities where one can take over after the other goes, which usually doesn't happen until you get to a fairly hefty sized group.
So who do you think
Like
was the personality of the cult? then?
So it's like,
Was
you
it
know,
Peter or
your
Paul?
Joseph Smith Brigham Young scenario, for
So
example,
you think it
where
was Paul, basically, right?
no, Paul didn't come along till later. You know that Paul didn't
Yeah,
come
yeah.
until the cult was
So
already
who do you think
successful.
was the personality? Was it Peter?
It would have to
Or
be Peter, yeah, because Peter is the one that
oh,
Paul names as being the first to see the resurrected Jesus.
okay.
So Peter's reading his scriptures, and he's piecing it together. And whether there was a genuine vision or not, we don't know. We have no idea how honest Peter was about this. So we got the same
Hmm.
situation with Paul. We don't know if there were any actual visions, but we know that he pieced this together from scripture, and then he begins the cult. And you've got the other pillars. So it's entirely possible that James and John were involved in some way. Maybe one of them was the leader. Maybe there was a predecessor, and Paul and Peter took over from that predecessor as well. We don't know.
Hmm.
It's a bit cloudy. But just in the most plausible version for me, it is Peter who actually finds this message, begins the cult, and then 20 years later, or so, sorry, 5 years later, isn't it?
Yeah,
Paul's been there about 15 years before he starts writing the letters that we get
yeah.
roughly 5 years later. Once they've managed to get a foothold in Jerusalem and a few in the diaspora, that's when Paul comes along in the diaspora, picks up on this little cult, and manages to take over after a bit of investigation. And then you've got
Okay.
the diaspora under Paul's control mostly, and you've got the ones in Jerusalem under, or Judea, I should say, under Peter's control, and then you get that whole clash of personalities and the fighting
Hmm.
between them.
Yeah. So, what about the verse where Paul mentions that the crucifixion is the greatest stumbling block to the Jews? Like, doesn't that make it seem less likely that they would have made that up? If it was causing such a problem for that they weren't able to convince very many Jews to join their side. They had to, in fact, they had to go to the Gentiles eventually because the Gentiles were more accepting of it. That the Christ would be someone who died and rose again. Like the Jews weren't having any of that,
Oh,
and
yeah, well, it's
why
very
would they make that up though? If it would make their movement, cause so much trouble for their movement,
it's a phenomenon that continues to this day that religion works best when it's foreign. People like to have their mysterious stuff come from other countries. Like Buddhism is inexplicably popular in America, for example. Um, But you've also got the whole stumbling block idea. Well, they were waiting for their Messiah. Don't forget this Judaism was incredibly diverse at the time, and in particular kept getting stomped by the Romans. So to your average Jew, which is a difficult thing to try and piece together because they were so varied, but to the ones that you were talking about who were waiting for a Messiah, that absolutely is a stumbling block. If they're expecting a military leader and you give them a guy who got killed by the Romans, that's not going to work out great. But it does work outside of the diaspora, especially if you play down the whole. If you start out without the Romans killing him, if you start out with just the celestial Jesus, it's not until later you get that solidified in Mark, for example. So you start out with the celestial Jesus being crucified, and you say, well, here we have yet another savior cult. That's as I think it was Justin Martyr said, this is nothing different to what you already believe. We're not telling you any stories that you haven't heard before. So that would make
Okay,
perfect sense
so
to be popular outside of Judea, but not as popular in Judea.
yeah, but then why would it have started in Judea? Why would it have
Well,
started with
because it's a
Jews?
Jewish cult. I mean, you're going to get
Yeah,
Jewish
but
cult
like
in
it
Judea.
doesn't seem like something that Jews would have made up though. That's the thing. Like
Well,
why
the
would they have
Jews
made
didn't
up
make it up.
something that
One
is
guy
completely
made it up.
contrary to
So the Jews are not this
Yeah.
autonomous collective where they all have exactly the same belief and they're not allowed to think of anything new.
Yeah. Well, one guy made it up and he wasn't immediately shut up by his peers who all said, "What? That's idiotic. That's
Which
stupid."
argues for Peter already being a respected rabbi in some way, or maybe not rabbi at the time, but a religious leader in some way, an educated, wealthy man. Because if he was the uneducated fisherman of the Gospels, then obviously he's going nowhere with that. But if you take the mythicist view that Peter could read, which therefore puts him in some position already of a superior, like aristocracy style position, or a religious leader or something, someone with training, then you got the perfect sense out of it because he's already in a position where he has followers already, and he's just making a tweak to an existing position that he holds.
Hmm.
So this is why it's interesting to see the two theories side by side and sort of flesh them out and go, what details do we have on the historical Jesus version and the mythical Jesus version, and how do they stack up to each other? Because you can see, like I mentioned before, Peter never mentioning that, or Paul never mentioning that Peter's illiterate, never holding that over him. It's very odd, but it makes perfect sense if Peter is literate and he got it
I
from Scripture.
still really just don't get your characterization of that as odd. I mean, like what makes you think that
So in this
it would
debate,
be expected to?
if you couldn't read and I could,
Uh-huh.
would that be an advantage for me in this debate?
Yeah.
So I would use that, and you would have to respond to that and defend yourself. There's back and forth. So if you only had
Wait,
the
how
writing
would you
from one
use
of
it
us,
though? Would you just be like, "Ha ha, I can read, you can't"? Like,
yeah, I'd be
what?
a
I
total
mean,
asshole about it.
I don't think that that's I don't think that I don't see any reason why we should expect Paul to be like that.
Now,
Honestly.
this is a friendly conversation, but don't forget, in the case of Paul and Peter, there was money at stake. That makes
Okay.
people vicious.
Okay. Uh, I mean, I just honestly don't really
So what's your explanation?
see
Why does
it
Paul never mention Peter being illiterate?
because I don't think that there would be any advantage of that.
You don't think that in a world where scriptures are everything, being able to read scriptures gives you any advantage over someone who can't read scriptures?
Well, most Jews at the time were illiterate and they memorized scriptures, so that's how
Most
they.
Jews weren't cult leaders.
Yeah, but so
So you've got two people
most
vying
Jews
for
were
control
illiterate.
of a
So it's like
cult.
Paul would be. It's kind of hard to make fun of somebody for something that most of the population also has.
This
Like
isn't an egalitarian population you're talking about. This is cult leaders with people who look up to them and are subservient to them. This is how cults work. The
okay,
people are kept in subjugation. It's all about pretending you know more than them. It's how cults work now. The preacher has to seem aloof compared to the congregation. Otherwise, they won't respect him. They won't listen to him preach. That's the whole nature of preaching. Is it's a one-way communication. So you have to keep some authority over them. You have to be able to hold some power over them. And when you've got two preachers fighting each other, any advantage from one or the other is going to be in there. Like you can see the tension between Paul and Peter. And to say that Paul would just have been gracious and not used a particular advantage, a massive advantage like that over him, is very unlikely. Now, it's not impossible, but if you're considering the balance of odds and you're being fair about your judgment of historicity versus non-historicity, that is a point in favor of Paul's version of Jesus, or so I should say, the mythical Jesus, because that scenario doesn't hold if you've got an illiterate fisherman Peter.
I disagree. I don't think that your argument is strong enough. I think I mean, maybe if you had like examples of other instances where cult leaders, made fun of other, other competitors for being illiterate. I mean,
Well,
I
does
just
it happen?
don't
And
think that
are
that
any
would.
other cult leaders illiterate? Is Peter an anomaly here? Are there any cult leaders basing their cults on scripture who couldn't read?
Are you talking about Muhammad?
Muhammad could clearly read. He was a
Okay.
son of a warlord.
Yeah.
Son of a merchant, I think. Yeah, he was clearly literate. That was a lie that was spreading
Okay.
last, which exactly fits the nature of. In fact, they probably inherited the idea from the gospel stories,
Mhm.
because you start out with these cult leaders who are highly educated, wealthy men, like Philo, for example. Not necessarily cult leader, but you know what I mean. He's
Mhm.
educated, wealthy enough to afford to be able to spend his time on reading. And
Okay.
then you have the story where you're going, well, we need to try and sell this to the masses. We need to sell this to the poor. So you rewrite the apostles into disciples and you make them poor fishermen. You make them the common man. And that makes the story more
Mhm.
appealing.
Mhm. Well, I just don't think that it's a very strong argument to say, to base your argument on what Paul doesn't say rather than what he does say. I just because there
So,
could be any number of
for
reasons
example,
why he
it,
doesn't say something. And just saying that it's odd, I don't think is a very strong argument.
so if Paul had said somewhere in his letters, Jesus did not live on earth. He was only a celestial being. He was crucified in the heavens and so on. What are the
Mhm.
odds that that mention would survive until this day given that the historicist sect won, and we know they destroyed records, we know they forged letters, they even forged Paul's letters in the Bible. You know they
Well,
tampered with
I think if Paul had said that, I don't think that the historicist sect would have won.
How do you know he didn't?
How do I know he didn't? I'm not claiming to know. I'm just claiming that I don't. It doesn't seem very likely that the historicist sect would have won if Paul made an explicit claim like that.
It's not about
That Jesus
one, it's
was
about,
not
so we
physical,
know
that
which sect won.
he was
What are the odds that
celestial.
they would, well, what are the odds that a historicist sect having won would have kept that in Paul without,
Yeah, I
destroying it?
guess they. Yeah, I mean, the
So
claim that
if you're fair
you
to
know.
mythicism, it's
Mm,
ridiculous to expect any explicit mentions to survive in Paul, given what we know about Christian forgery, Christian destruction of scripture and literature and all that stuff. So
okay.
we can't say that we would expect to have an explicit mention in Paul, given that the
Okay.
historicist sect was in power for so long and destroyed whatever they didn't like, or just didn't preserve it. You don't even have to actively destroy stuff.
Okay.
So to
But
be
I
fair
mean,
to
there's
historicity and to
yeah.
mythicism, we have to account for who kept the records.
Yeah, but that doesn't like really get us anywhere. It's just okay. So Paul could have written something that supports mythicism, and it's just we don't have it anymore. Okay. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know,
Just wanted to make that clear, because
yeah.
I get that straw manned occasionally. Sorry.
All right. Well, I think probably my biggest problem with not mythicism, but like this specific type of mythicism, the carrier school mythicism that Jesus was believed to be a celestial being who was crucified in the lower heavens or whatever. I, I just don't think that this. I haven't seen any evidence that this is something that would have been likely to have. It's a bizarre belief that somebody can get crucified in, in the heavens, like in this.
Crucified?
Yeah.
Doesn't say crucified.
Okay. So what is it then?
Just killed in any form and then hanged. I mean, like I said, stoning would apply.
Okay.
Could have been crucifixion, but don't forget that we have to watch out for reading in later stuff from the Gospels back into Paul. So if you're just examining Paul, you have to be really
Mhm.
careful not to keep importing stuff like who the disciples were, or things that Jesus said, or anything that doesn't actually appear in Paul. Like
Okay.
when you say brother of Jesus, I have to keep going. That's not in Paul.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, when Jesus or when Paul says the Lord, he's referring to Jesus. So
Yeah, so it's very important to avoid misrepresenting what's happening. You have to make sure that you're explicit about what is and what isn't there, because otherwise you get the wrong impression. So you end up adjusting your probabilities in the wrong way because of something that you've put into the text rather than what's actually in the text. And it's so easy to do. I do it too all the time. So um, it's just be careful to do that when you're judging your odds back and forth one way or the other.
mm. Well, I think pretty much the main thing that I disagree on is just seems more likely to me that there was a real Jewish street preacher who started a religious movement and was crucified. I mean, that kind of thing happened all the time, back then. And so there's nothing inherently improbable about that. And I don't see I don't I don't see enough evidence that it was as common for people to dream up, uh, you know, deities that were crucified, or not maybe not crucified, maybe just their bodies were hung up. They were killed and their bodies were hung up in the lower heavens. I mean, that just I don't know. I mean,
Well,
it just
don't
doesn't
forget
seem
where
like
they're
something
getting
that would
this
be
from.
as
So
likely.
even on the historical Jesus, this is still a theological point they're making, because anything that they kept from a historical Jesus and that they transferred into Paul's arguments, for example, these are all theological points. They don't mention anything unless there's an actual reason for it, unless there's a teaching moment out of it.
Mm,
So the hanging up thing, the point of that is the humiliation aspect. The point is the Yom Kippur ritual, isn't it? The making sure that there's scandalous, terrible death, the punishment for sins. That's the point of that.
Yeah, but humiliation in what sense? Because humiliation that we're familiar with is like, okay, so there's people around, and like, is there people in the lower heavens? Like, humiliation, like it just doesn't really make sense in that context. Like, okay, and
Well, don't
so
forget they were still
so he
thinking
had a
about it.
mortal bottle. He had a more mortal body in the lower heavens, and so he died in the heavens, and he came back to life in the heavens.
That's just how it worked out. But I
Okay.
mean, to be fair, Paul could have entirely made this up and said, in the land of Nod on Earth somewhere, he did that. That's
Okay.
not really the main point. The point is that this is coming from Paul. This is coming from Paul's visions. This is coming from the visions of the previous people. Don't forget that in Paul, the first time Jesus appears to anyone is in 1 Corinthians 15, which is after his death.
Okay. Well, I mean,
Very odd for Jesus not to appear
he
to
just
anyone
doesn't he
before.
just begins there. He doesn't say he didn't appear before his death. I mean,
Well, Cephas was the first to see him,
well,
and the
appear
first
wouldn't
to
have
see
been the
him
right
after
word
his
to
death.
use, for appear wouldn't be the right word to use
And then he
before
appeared to
somebody had
many.
died.
Yeah, so it's kind of an odd thing as well. It's just the whole silence makes no sense to me. Why would Paul not mention anything about Jesus while talking exclusively about Jesus? I don't know
Because
how
he
you
didn't
can
care that much
avoid
about
that.
Jesus' earthly life. He cared more about the theological aspect of it.
So you're talking about my perspective being unlikely, but that's very unlikely. And I don't see how you can rationalize that without also adjusting your probabilities.
Well, in my opinion, all of the explanations you've given for the verses that I brought up, I think have been kind of unnatural and awkward readings of the verses.
Of course, they're unnatural.
Um,
They're all celestial and
so,
vision based. It doesn't make sense.
well,
Christianity itself is
by
illogical.
unnatural, I mean like they're not straight. Like if you read this without any presuppositions or anything, then you would assume that it's talking about an earthly Jesus, or about an
Well,
earthly figure.
if you read Paul without any presuppositions, then you assume it's a celestial Jesus. What you're doing is taking the Gospels back into Paul.
I disagree. I think that it would,
So when Paul
especially
explicitly
the part
says,
about him saying that that Jesus on the night that he was handed over, he talks about a specific night, I think that would lead somebody who does not have the mythicist presupposition, would lead that person to imagine a physical meal on Earth with other people.
so let's say you didn't have any other texts and you just had Paul's letters and just the surviving ones, what we have now.
Okay.
And Paul says, I did not receive this from anyone except visions and scripture, and then says, and I received in the same way this particular story. You're going to go, well, that's clearly a vision. Then that's how it reads naturally in Paul.
Well, he
If
doesn't
you
say
don't
that
import
though
anything else from
in that
anywhere else,
passage. He says he just says I received it from the Lord. He doesn't say I didn't receive it
exactly. So
from
I
anyone.
received visions and I received
Uh
this.
huh.
So if you read it naturally, the natural reading is that's the same way that Paul receives all of his other visions.
But the idea that, or the portrayal, the imagery that's being used in this passage seems to be pointing to a you know a real physical event that happened on Earth.
Well, Paul is
Because
talking about a physical event. He's talking about the collective meals of Christians, and then he's taking that and making it a Jesus story to try and justify these communal meals, which look very pagan from another perspective.
I mean, he's saying. I mean, again, he's saying that it happened on a specific night. In the
Yeah, it
past.
has to be, obviously, if you're going to have meals with people, you've got to be doing it. Well, not even with people. If you're going to eat something and make a point about your death, the logical place to set that is before your death. The meal is because it's the theological
Okay.
point. So everything about this makes more sense if it's a theological point he's making. Regardless of whether Jesus existed or not, this is still theology, not history.
Well, I mean, I don't think that Paul received all of this from visions, obviously.
So if a historical Jesus existed, he did not have a meal where he said, "I predict that I'm going to be executed tomorrow. I predict that I'll be betrayed by Judas." That didn't happen. We can agree on that, right? He's not
Yeah,
clairvoyant.
yeah.
So regardless of whether Jesus existed or not, that event remains the same.
But he could have had a last meal with his followers. So,
The last meal? It reminds me of a
yeah.
meme where Judas goes, "Hey Jesus, you ready for the Last Supper?" The what? Oh, just normal supper.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wouldn't have been they wouldn't have known that it was a last meal at the time. It would have been after the fact. Okay, they would have
Exactly.
been looking
So that
back on it
whole
and
story makes
saying,
no
okay, so
sense.
that was the last meal. I don't know.
Unless Judas was really open about that.
I think it makes I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with it. That they had meals together, and then there was a last meal. That one of the meal that happened last, before Jesus was executed, was the last one.
Yeah,
I
which
mean,
means that all the talking about it and the symbolic bread breaking and all that was invention, because Jesus clearly didn't go, "Well, I'm going to die tomorrow, so here's some wine and bread."
well, maybe he did that multiple times.
That would be a terrible cult leader. "I'm going to die tomorrow. See you in the morning."
Yeah. uh,
Yeah, I don't think that
anyway,
makes sense. But to be fair, that event could be a vision in Paul, regardless of whether Jesus existed or not. So
all right.
I don't think it's evidence against Jesus. I don't think it's evidence for Jesus. It's something Paul made up to justify a cult ritual, which we know happened in other cults, group meals. Even in Judaism itself, you've got the Passover meal, for example, at least.
Okay. So, the main reason what's the main reason that you think that Jesus didn't exist? That you think that the scales tip in favor of mythicism?
Okay, so do you know the Rank-Raglan hero index? Have you read that
Yes.
particular argument? Yeah. So
Yeah.
how many people who score more than half on the Rank-Raglan index are real people?
I don't know.
0.
Oh, okay.
So in Carrier's book, for the sake of argument, he granted the historicity of Moses, I recall, and a couple of other people who didn't exist.
Okay.
But if you look at the Rank-Raglan hero index, you go above 50% on that, and Jesus is near the top. Every single person who falls into that top 50% scoring is a fake person, didn't exist. So Jesus as a character is, if he did exist, unique in history, which means unique, very very rare, very low odds. So the
Okay.
odds of someone like that really existing, based on all of our other examples, he's fiction. Based on every single other case where this has happened.
Interesting.
So
Well,
have you heard that
I don't know
argument?
enough about that. I mean, I've heard it a little bit, but I haven't. I don't know enough about it because I mean, what determined the exact character traits that would be included in this in this
So
list
this is
and stuff
about
like that.
how
Like,
a particular person develops by it. So at any point, if they've got these attributes, then they fall
you're
into this
talking about
category.
having an enunciation before their birth, preaching on a hill or like
Dying
going
on a
going
hill,
on a
yeah, all
hill,
that
dying
stuff.
on a hill. Yeah, that. Yeah, I mean, so you can pick out
So the Rank-Raglan mythotype,
characteristics. I could pick out different characteristics, and
I
then
think
that would be a
Oedipus
different
is the
list.
highest scorer. Oedipus gets like 21 out of
Okay.
21 or something. But that's the thing about this. It's a reference class because this is a well-established mythotype where we say fictional characters tend to fall into this sort of category. And obviously, it's not perfect system. It was made up by this one guy, so you could probably you could go down a different road and say, okay, what do all mythical characters have in common? Maybe we can build a new list that does this. But I reckon every which way you do that, Jesus is such a mythological person that you are going to end up fitting him into a mythological reference class, which means that's an extraordinary claim to say this person existed sometime when no other person falling into this kind of category exists. So that lowers your odds
Another
of him
thing,
existing.
another thing that kind of that I kind of have a problem with that argument is that I don't agree that Jesus died on a hill. I don't agree that there was an annunciation before his birth,
It's
anything like that.
so we don't know, but the point
Those
is,
are stories that were written about him,
yeah,
fictional stories. So,
we don't think Oedipus died that way. We don't think Heracles died that way. That's
uh-huh.
not the point. The point is that these legends grew around a person. Is the person
Okay.
behind the legend real or not? And you go past the 50% mark on the score,
Well,
and
I
they're
could write a story
always not
about
there.
you where you pass like 100% on all the characteristics, and it would be a fictional story,
Absolutely,
right?
you could do that.
And but that wouldn't mean that you didn't exist.
No,
Like
but it changes
it
the
just
prior
it
probability.
seems I don't know. It's like
That's a perfect example. So let's take this as ways you could overcome this. If you did write a story about me like that, then it would require more evidence for people to believe I existed, because people like that tend not to exist. Fortunately, there is evidence that I exist in various forms. So if there was evidence that Jesus existed, that would overcome that low prior probability. All it would take is one explicit mention, one independent source, one eyewitness account, something like that. That would be enough. The problem is the evidence is so convoluted, so compromised, so weak, so secondhand, that we really can't get a clear picture of what happened. So all we've got to go on is these little fragments of probability. And that's a really strong argument against him having existed, because nobody else like that has ever existed as far as we know.
okay. So no one else who has had that kind of story written about them has
Nobody
existed.
else who
All
hits
right.
more than half of the points on the scale now.
In the fictional
So
stories written about them.
Moses,
All
for example,
right.
Moses hits a lot of those points, doesn't he?
Okay.
You know, with the whole basket story, doing miracles and parting things,
Mm,
the whole narrative that happens, raised by a king and all that stuff.
mm,
So there's loads of these points where if you get Moses into that, it's starting to
mm.
look like he doesn't exist. And then you go and examine the evidence for Moses. What do we actually have? Like Thomas L. Thompson did, and discovered, wait, it doesn't look like Moses existed. All these stories are fiction. And then you look at Jesus and you go, well,
Yeah.
these stories are clearly fiction. The Gospels, I assume you accept the Gospels are just complete fiction. There's no way that stuff
Mm,
really happened. The
yeah.
trial makes no sense. The
Mm,
narrative, the narrator knowing, perfect knowledge,
mhm.
all of these things lining up. Just the narrative convenience of it is insane.
Okay.
So you've got massively fictional stories, and you go, okay, well, what's the original time this character appeared? And you go back to Paul. Paul, who has no knowledge of this stuff, never heard of Judas, never heard of Mary, never heard of Joseph, never heard of Nazareth, doesn't know about any teachings, any ministry, anything like that. It's just, this looks like euhemerization in process, where a mythological character is then put into history as a convenience
Mm,
for spreading the word about him and saying, okay, we have this issue where people are having visions all over the place and everyone can just join the cult when they like. People like Paul, damn that Paul. Let's nail this down so that we can't have any old person claiming to have visions and join us. Let's write an actual history. Let's say only these people are authorities on this, and you can only then have power if these people allow you to. That nails down the structure of the cult, which happens once cults reach a certain point. They want to solidify into scriptures. You see this
mm.
happening everywhere with
Yeah,
cults.
but
And of course, cargo cults are the example where it starts off with
okay.
visions, then becomes scripture.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting argument, but I think that's a kind of I think that's kind of a flimsy way to assess probability. I think there are better ways to assess probability. Like
Okay, what?
if you look at these fictional characters, they have there's things about these fictional characters that are completely different when you look at Jesus. Like for instance,
They're all
these
different. That's
these
what makes them
characters.
unique.
Well, no. I mean, like they tend to be they have these qualities that seems to um, point or tip the skills less in the direction of historicity for them
He
that
is
don't apply to
literally the
Jesus.
Son of God.
Okay, I
I
mean,
mean, you can't get much more mythical than that.
well, there were historians who claimed that Caesar Augustus was the son of God, and
Do we have good
they,
evidence to counteract that? So, say you have
uh,
someone claimed to be the Son of God, Caesar Augustus. This guy was the Son of God. No evidence supporting his existence. Do we think he existed?
mm,
Without evidence,
Well,
you would say
what?
no, because that's a very
I mean,
unlikely claim.
not really, because that wouldn't be the only thing said about him, right?
Exactly. So the
If it was
thing
just
that makes him exist, the thing that makes us believe he existed, is the evidence supporting his existence, which overcomes the lower probability of a god existing. Someone claims a god exists, we go, no. Someone claims a god exists, oh, but it's actually this guy and I've got coins minted with his name on it. Fair enough. We think he probably existed.
okay.
It's about having
Well,
evidence to support your position. So if you don't have evidence for Jesus the same way you have evidence for Caesar Augustus, then you're in a different situation, aren't you?
claiming that somebody's the son of God, though, is kind of
Makes it less
like
likely that they exist.
you could just say that about an ordinary person, and that's like it's not
And people won't
you know
believe you.
it's not that hard to believe that somebody would believe that a person is the son of God.
I
Like,
probably wouldn't believe you.
but no, I mean it's hard. It's not that hard to believe that somebody would believe that somebody was the son of God, that somebody would be regarded as the son of God or as a god or something like that, because people have done that throughout history. But I think that's kind of a different thing from
So take
claiming that
take
somebody
your
like turned
sample
water into wine, because that's a like you could say, that Joe Schmo is the son of God, and I could be like, yeah, whatever, you believe that, okay. But if I say like Joe Schmo turned water into wine, that's kind of a different thing. That can actually be like, you know, that's something that can actually be observed, right? That's
which
not.
isn't a claim that's in Paul, is it?
Yeah, I know. Paul doesn't claim that Jesus turned water into wine.
Yeah. So that doesn't get you
Right?
anywhere near the whole earthly Jesus thing. But my point
Okay.
was, if so, let's go with the Son of God claim. Let's take
Uh,
every example that we've got, or like a fair pool of examples, a random selection of people who are the sons of gods, and let's go
okay.
of that collection. What are the odds that they actually existed?
Okay. Well,
So
I mean,
I don't
every
have
Roman emperor was believed to be the son of God, right? Pretty much
uh,
every Roman empire emperor
so they all
claimed
have
that.
lower probabilities of existing, but they have strong evidence of existing. Being an emperor is
Okay.
quite a rare thing. And to be fair, being a Roman emperor is a more specific class. So we can actually just ditch the whole Son of God thing and go, Roman emperor, did they exist? So obviously, the more specific you can be about your starting point, the better it is. But sons of God in general, most of them didn't exist.
Yeah. Well, there's other things that I think um, need to be taken into consideration when we compare Jesus with these other figures. For instance, they tend to have the accounts written of them seem to be um, for the fictional characters. They seem to be placed in either a mythical past, a completely mythical past, or in the distant past. For instance, with Moses, Moses isn't mentioned, until Moses is said to have lived in like the 15th century BC, and the account written of his life was written in like the 7th or 6th century. So that's like 600 years, or no, not 600. That's more than 600, like uh, 800 years. So I mean that's quite different from what we have with Jesus, who was written about decades, not even 100 years, just decades after he lived, after he supposedly lived. And with Romulus, the earliest account of Romulus was written in 200 BC, which is 500 years after his death. And the earliest account of or his supposed death, when he was claimed to have died, the earliest account of Odysseus is the Odyssey, which was written in 700 BC, and Odysseus is claimed to have lived around 1200 BC. So that's again, it's hundreds of years. Robin Hood, King Arthur, and King Arthur. Okay, so King Arthur, historians actually tend to think that King Arthur actually was based on a real person, not that the legends about him are true, but that there was a historical, like a British war chieftain or something that lived in like the 500s, and the earliest account we have of him is the Historia Britonum, which was written 300 years after he was said to have lived. I'm
Well,
going to turn on
you
a light
can
real
set
quick.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, you can set historical or fictional characters whenever you like in history. Obviously, it's easier
Uh-huh.
to move a fictional character around in history than it is otherwise. But you only need 20 or 30 years to go heavy myth on it. For example, what about Ned Ludd?
Okay.
Very
Yeah,
short
I
time
mean,
span there,
like,
and that's in a world with
I'm
universal
not saying that
literacy.
this is a slam dunk argument. I'm just saying that this, I think, needs to be assessed when we're talking about, when we're comparing Jesus to these other figures. And there's another thing. I'm kind of curious to hear what you think of this, but um, if Jesus was a fictional deity, um, who's not based on any historical person, it seems kind of strange to me that they would have given him such a common name, because the name Yeshua was the sixth most common name in Palestine. So if I'm going to make up a deity, why would I name a you know why would I name it something that is a common name that I know people with that name, real regular people who named that. I mean, think
Well, they
of
may have
like
gotten
other
it from the
deities like
same.
Zeus or Poseidon. Like, I
Yeah, so
mean,
so talking about the name, I mean, you could argue
uh-huh,
that they got that from Zechariah, where it specifically says Jesus, the son of Jehovah, which is something that Philo picked up on as well, which is interesting. But also, if you're going to call your person Jesus Christ, which means Savior Hero, that's a perfect name for your Savior Hero, isn't it?
yeah. Except that there's a bunch of people named that. Like
And
Joe
also,
Schmo down the
if
street
you've got
is
it's a very
yeah.
unusual thing to have somebody aptly named. It's usually the mark of a fictional character, like Victor Frankenstein, very ironic name that Mary Shelley decided for him. So
Okay.
naming people poetically is something that happens more often in fiction. So it kind of leans in that
Okay.
direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the Jewish names back then had theological significance. Like, I think Hezekiah means God is my strength or something. Like, I mean, that would have had theological significance too.
Yeah,
I
my
mean,
name has theological significance, means Jehovah is God.
yeah. And so, like,
That's just what happens
anybody,
when you have a
like
culture where
most
every
names,
name has theology behind it.
yeah. So that doesn't really help your argument then,
That
because
doesn't go
you're
one way or
claiming
the
that
other, does it?
you're
Because it
you're claiming
means
that.
that
Go ahead.
I mean, it doesn't go one way or the other because it was a common name. Yep, plausible.
Hmm.
It's also a name with theological significance, also plausible. So it doesn't tip it one way or the other, I think.
Okay. Well,
I think there was some apt
another
names
thing
in
you
the
can.
Gospels too, like Joseph of Arimathea. Do you remember that one? Or
Yeah,
Barabbas.
yeah,
Lots of very
yeah,
suspicious-looking names there.
yeah. I think that those characters didn't exist.
Paul was
um,
also very fond of calling him the Lord as well.
yeah. And another thing that you can also look at is like whether the historical or not historical, whether the figures in question, the mythical figures in question, are like whether they are improbable given the historical context of their the environment that they are set in the stories. Like, for instance, Moses. Is it likely? Is it is what is the probability that there would be somebody who was raised as an Egyptian who like turned against the Egyptians, and went had this journey where he went back to Israel, crossed the desert, and then came back and started performing, and started like speaking to the Pharaoh, and leading this whole leading led his people out of Egypt. Like, what is the prior probability of that? I mean, I would say it's very low. Like that kind of thing. Okay, yeah, the prior
Yeah, fair
probability
enough.
is just low for that. And so, in contrast to Jesus, I mean, there were lots of Palestinian street preachers who started religious movements and got crucified, in the first century. So,
Absolutely.
If you look at that's 3 examples that I gave of, I'm not saying that this is true of every case, but I think that when you assess probability, you need to look at these things, like these other categories that Jesus doesn't fit in, these other ways that he's not quite like the others. I mean,
well, so if you take the historical Jesus idea, let's say we had a claim that a guy called Jesus was crucified by the Romans and died, and that was where it ended. Fair enough.
okay.
There's no reason not to believe that claim. But then what we have is theological claims. We've got not historical records. We've got claims about godhood. We've got claims about miracles. We've got claims about changing the face of the world by people who are not impartial. These are religious claims. We've got no hostile accounts. We've got no accounts from contemporary historians. The only source for historical Jesus is Mark. And then you've got pre-Mark, we've got Paul, which goes against a historical Jesus. So if you factor all this evidence in, you take it all out and just have the Jesus basically from Mark, and you have like a really stripped down version. Fair enough, that Jesus is plausible. But that's only happens when you cherry pick evidence. You put the rest of the evidence back in, and it goes back to the original probability, which is that Jesus probably didn't exist.
Cherry picking evidence. I mean, I don't think it's cherry picking to look at an ancient account.
Look at the way you treat Paul.
The parts that seem far fetched with the parts that don't seem far fetched. I mean,
look at the way you have to treat Paul in order to argue for a historical Jesus. You have to pick pieces out where there's an ambiguous phrase about a brother. There's an ambiguous phrase about being born of a woman. There's an ambiguous phrase about being a servant. And then you have to throw the rest of Paul out because it's not helpful in arguing for that Jesus.
Well, I don't think it's that ambiguous, honestly. I think that the only ambiguity comes when you bring up these you bring in these alternative interpretations that I think are kind of unnatural interpretations and don't really.
I think yours are alternative and unnatural, so that's kind of where it leads us. That's why it means ambiguous, because you can read the phrase in multiple ways.
Well, I mean, most scholars don't read the phrase that way, so that's the thing.
Like, most scholars are Christians.
Well, most scholars aren't fundamentalists. Most Christians aren't,
and most of them are funded by Christians, which isn't very helpful in this. There's some serious issues with biblical scholarship that we can go over separately. However, I think it's like 11 o'clock now, so we should wrap up. But we should do this again, and I think we should explore some more detailed stuff, do a little bit of research, because I want to go back over this and see where I made mistakes. Obviously, I couldn't think of anything at the time where Paul would have clinched the argument by mentioning something Jesus said. And I'll go back over this and just check where I've made mistakes, and I'm sure other people can point out as well. I realize now
maybe I can figure out what went wrong with the live video, the Facebook live video, because
it'd be cool to do that.
I mean, I don't know why it wasn't working. It always worked before.
I've realized that Pine Creek, Doug, and Scott have been typing stuff into the YouTube.
Oh, I can't even see the comments.
Which, my bad. I didn't look at that while we were talking. But that's fine. We can go over those as well later and have a look. So thanks for the conversation. It was fun, and I enjoyed testing my memory. Sorry that I couldn't think of everything on the spot, but I gave it a shot.
Yeah,
you did really well as well. Keeping your argument structured, making sure that and of course you responded to me as well, not reading from a script. We're going back and forth. So I think this went really well. I enjoyed it, and who knows, you may change my mind as well. Because I'm not as confident on the mythical Jesus now as I was earlier. Mostly just from just the state of the evidence going, it is so badly compromised. Rereading Ehrman and seeing all the corruption that's gone into things, especially with Eusebius's rewriting of church history, and there's so much that's changed from the original texts that we don't even know what they said. So it's very difficult to judge what they meant. But it's going to be an interesting thing.
What would you say is your confidence level that Jesus didn't exist?
I'd say about 90% at the moment, because there's just too many holes. There's too much wrong with it. But that's still a respectable chance of 1 in 10. I reckon Jesus could have existed, and it's just that there's nothing left of him, as Robert Price said. Even if there was a Jesus, we've got no pieces left. At this point, we're scraping for scraps and single word mentions from Paul, which might mean a brother or might not.
Yeah.
That shows the desperation in terms of how corrupt this evidence is. So yeah, I think we'll never know one way or the other. All we can do is evaluate what
Well,
we've got
yeah.
and
I mean,
lean on it.
I still think that the evidence for Jesus is much better than the evidence for a lot of other historical figures, like the ones that I mentioned to you. I mean, and
Well,
I'm
Romulus, fair enough.
constantly thinking of, well, the other historical figures like Zeno, the philosopher Zeno, the
Yeah, but
philosopher
as I pointed out,
Thales.
they don't fit on
You
the
know,
Rank-Raglan scale in the same way. So already
all
there,
right.
it's a different kind of claim. It's not an extraordinary claim, is it?
Well, I mean, I'm
Although
just talking about
Pythagoras,
like
to be
the
fair,
evidence that
maybe
we
he
have
didn't
for them,
exist.
the accounts that we have, of them,
Yeah,
like
but
the
what we
accounts that
should
we
do
have
is
of them that are hundreds of years after they died.
maybe we could do another conversation where we sit down and we go
Yeah.
through like a few examples, and we just look at them piece by piece and evaluate evidence, because that's ultimately
Yeah.
what this is about, is trying to do an unbiased examination of what the probabilities are in each direction, and making
Mhm.
sure that we don't read anything into it, which we can stop each other doing, because we can feed back and say, no, you're making an assumption there.
Yeah. All right.
So yeah, I think we should finish it now. So
All
sorry
right.
for how long this
Yep.
video was.
Oh, that's
Um,
fine. It's later for you, so
yeah.
thank you for your patience and willing to go this. So it's like 11 for you right now, right?
Yes, it is. But
Okay.
yeah, I'll look forward to doing it another time, because I
Yeah.
have been trying to get more into this, because in written
Mhm.
debates, you miss out on the nuance, you miss out on
Yeah.
the expressions, and just being able to do this back and forth where you can get
Yeah.
lost behind a wall of text, and
Mhm.
you might come across as a bit more. Well, you just might miscommunicate, basically. You might come
Yeah.
across as an asshole when you don't mean to. So,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, I
And I think
appreciate
people
this.
are tend to be kinder and more civil when debating live than when debating in comments. you
Yes,
know.
especially
So
YouTube comments. Stay away from the
yeah.
comments.
Yeah. All
Okay,
right.
thanks. I'm gonna hit stop now. So.